Hey everyone, our Superboy coverage continues this week with a discussion of the New Adventures of Superboy comic book series from the early 1980s. In the first part of our episode, I am joined by John Wilson of John Reads Comics to discuss the Cary Bates written run of the series. Then, in the second part of our discussion, Rob O'Connor from the All-Star Superfan podcast tags in as we discuss the Paul Kupperberg written run on the series. I hope you enjoy. The Adventures of Superman when he was a boy. For decades, Clark Kent's history as Superboy, both in Smallville and the future with the Legion of Superheroes, was a cornerstone of the Superman mythology. Despite being erased from comics continuity twice, the concept of Clark as Superboy has endured in various ways across time and media. It also represents the largest unexplored piece of my Superman fandom. Until now. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superboy fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the Bronze Age comic book series, The New Adventures of Superboy, is the host of John Reads Comics' first-time guest, John Wilson. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. You joined me on my George Reeves rewatch podcast for a season 1 episode. So you and I have podcasted before, but this is the first time that you're here on Digging for Kryptonite. And in case any of our audience members aren't familiar with you and your work, when I say John Reads Comics, man, have you lived up to that. Do you mind just giving our audience a sense, in the Superman space in particular, what we mean when we say John Reads Comics?
So when I got back into comics as an adult around 2008, 2009, I decided to give Superman a concentrated effort. I had read just a smattering of his comics when I was a kid, and I really wanted to learn more. So I started 2 reading projects. I started reading everything post-Crisis, starting with the Man of Steel. This was 5 minutes before the From Crisis to Crisis podcast started. So once they started up, I backtracked and started rereading along with their show and just kind of stayed in sync with them for a good long time. I fell off and am recatching up with them. But I also started reading with Action Comics #1. And I have read every Superman and Superman family comic from 1938. I'm into 1995 now. After I've passed the Death of Clark Kent storyline and reading the Superboy series. That's a very different Superboy to this one, of course, and Steel and everything else that goes along with that era. So I have read a good chunk of Superman's history from the beginning. And I also read a whole bunch of other stuff and podcast about it. Spider-Man, Marvel, various Superman-related things, Legion, Justice League. Right now I'm podcasting about Ninja Turtles and Transformers. So yeah, I read a lot.
Absolutely. That's astounding. I hope everyone was listening intently as you were rattling all of that off, because it's really something. I so admire that reading project, particularly when it comes to Superman. I don't know that I will ever undertake a reading project quite like what you just described, but there is a part of me that feels like if we do this long enough, I'll get there eventually. And if I do, I'll be asking you a lot of questions and following your example.
The great thing about the world we live in is there's so much that's available in reprints and digital collections that you can get, authorized, licensed copies of. And for those things that aren't available, authorized and licensed out there, there are other ways to get it. And you can read every single Superman story, every single Batman story. And it's fantastic.
Well, speaking of things that are generally not available commercially, New Adventures of Superboy. So this Bronze Age comic book series that ran for 54 issues, essentially the last hurrah of Pre-Crisis Superboy, with the exception of that Superman The Secret Years miniseries, which we're going to be getting to shortly as well. But his last solo series and last major outing before Crisis on Infinite Earths would wipe Clark's history as Superboy away, at least for the time being.
And because what had happened is the Superboy series as it was through the late 40s into the 50s, 60s, and 70s. By starting in the mid 70s, it became a Superboy and the Legion story. And they did this big thing just a month or 2 before this series started, where they decided to take Superboy and the Legion and split it. They had Superboy quit the Legion of Superheroes, and he would only make occasional guest appearances from this point forward. And the Legion got its own book. ironically, the Legion kept the numbering from Superboy. So Superboy became Superboy and the Legion, then it became just the Legion. And Superboy got his own new solo book where he was once again in Smallville having adventures like he had done, like I said, from the late 40s into the early 70s.
Absolutely. And in fact, our last episode covered the Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes stretch. And the last issue that we looked at, Legion of Superheroes 259, ends with a little blurb that says, read the incredible adventures of Superboy in, and then they have the image of the cover to the series that you and I are talking about, now on sale. So we're going right from that discussion into this. Now, I know that there were a couple of other stepping stones to this series along the way a few years earlier. I know there was an appearance, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You've read all of this stuff, but for myself and for the audience, there was an outing for Superboy in DC Superstars number 12 in 1976. It was released then. It's called Don't Call Me Superboy. And then he had short stints in Adventure Comics from issues 453 to 458, from 77 to 78. And then in Superman Family from numbers 191 through 198 in 78 to 79. So again, this appearance in Superstars and then short stints in Adventure Comics and Superman Family while the Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes stuff was going on before this series. Does that line up with your recollection?
Yeah, so they're probably just, testing the market for a solo Superboy series again, wanted to see how it was. And a lot of that was also by Carrie Bates, who is writing what we're writing today. So they're probably just gauging the market. Superboy is a member of the Legion, and the Legion was so popular. Would there still be interest in a, solo Superboy back at home series again? And so they like to test the market with those kinds of things. And I guess they figured yes, and they were right for a good number of years.
Yes. So this entire series that we're here to talk about, again, ran for 54 issues. For purposes of our discussion, you and I revisited, broadly speaking, the first 33 issues, which were written by Carrie Bates and drawn by Kurt Schaffenberger. And Schaffenberger would continue on the book and draw it until its conclusion, including the Paul Kupperberg run, which we'll be covering in our next discussion here. But I have to say, and of course I want to get your take on all of this, but I don't want to bury the lead, I had a great time reading these issues. And the audience might recall, I had less of a great time going through the Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes issues because he was part of that group. He was a member of this vast ensemble, and I craved more of the Smallville set Superboy-centric stories. So I could appreciate those Legion ones.
Return to that form, yeah.
Exactly. So we get here, and to your earlier point, now we are back squarely in the Smallville set stories. Clark is a student at Smallville High in his red sweater. We have the Kent General Store. Jonathan and Martha are major supporting players. We'll talk about that. We have Lana Lang, Professor Lang, Pete Ross, Bashford, Crypto a little bit here and there, primarily in backup stories, Chief Parker, and just we're back in that mode. And what I really liked about this is that I felt like it tapped into the innocence and some of the sensibilities of those Silver Age stories that I found really charming, but now we're in the Bronze Age, we're in the 80s, more modern storytelling sensibilities. We're not quite in, the fully modern era and the level of depth and nuance that we would see in the future. But for me, I just kind of found a really nice balance.
Because a lot of these books are always, Superboy series is always marketed at the younger end of the reading audience, so they're telling some similar plot lines with a little bit more depth, but they still know that Superboy is going to be read by younger readers a lot more than Superman is.
Exactly. But no, overall, I had such a great time. I feel like this is very much an overlooked gem, this series. Mm-hmm. And going back to availability, it's not available in any collected form. There are
the later issues, but none of these.
Yeah. In collected form or on the app?
Oh, I'm sorry, on the app.
Yeah, the app does have some, but it doesn't start until fairly deep into the series, and it's not the complete run, which is a shame. I actually, when I've had to, especially for our Golden and Silver Age readings, I've resorted to those other means you were alluding to earlier. But for this, I went on eBay. I was able to buy the entire series in single issue form. It did not break the bank, and it was doable. And I was like, all right, let me have these. I have to say, and I know you and the hardcore comics fans who would be listening to this will identify with this and appreciate it. The smell, Just that that old school, the comic book smell, and just seeing the ads and reading the letters pages. It's a different look. In an ideal scenario, I really do wish there were an omnibus or line of softcover collections of the series where it's clean and crisp and bright, and I think that would be the ideal reading experience for these. However, short of that, having those original issues was really cool because, again, having the ads, having the letter pages, the smell, it conjures all these other emotions. It was fun.
It's weird how we have such an emotional reaction to the smell of slightly rotten wood pulp.
Yep. Yeah, no, I know.
But there it is. It is what it is.
I know. So this was a treat. This really this reading tied together, I think, a lot about what I've been exploring over these episodes and a bit of what I've been wrestling with. And I would say big picture, and we were talking about this off mic, but the role of Jonathan and Martha in these stories, as well as the lessons that Superboy is learning as he's embarking on these adventures, really kind of showed me the concept of Superboy in a different light. And like I said, tied a lot together. I'm really excited to get into all of this with you. I guess just generally, big picture, what's your take on this run that we looked at and its place in either the Superboy story specifically or the larger Superman mythology? Like, just what's kind of your overall take on this run?
So one of the things that struck me, because I definitely want to talk to the 2 points you just made, but one other point just before we get into that, Schaffenberger's art on this was so suited for the normal people feel of the story, because although Superboy is doing Superboy things throughout, a lot of this series emphasizes his relationships with his parents, his relationships with his friends, his interactions at school. And so to bring Kurt Schaffenberger, who had been known for drawing Supergirl and Lois Lane over the years, and giving that sort of, I don't know, TV sitcom or, easy viewing kind of feel to the characters, really felt good here. I really enjoyed seeing Kurt Schaffenberger draw this run. He is one of my favorite all-time Superman artists. So seeing him here was great. But the things you were talking about with the parents, that was one of my big eye-opening experiences as I was reading through all of the Superman books. So I think most fans today don't really have much experience that predates this era. And if they do, they were very young when it happened, or they're very old fans and maybe they're not as much into the books anymore. But since most fans these days have experience with a character that is either of this era or later, the idea of the Kents shaping and molding Clark's experience as a superhero is a huge aspect of that. We get it a lot in Pre-Crisis because even adult Superman goes home to talk to his parents when he's having a moment of crisis. And we just get this feel that they were always there for him. A huge element of modern fandom is the Smallville TV show and Clark's growth as a teen hero, and Jonathan and Martha having a say in that every step of the way. That's a major thing. And all of that aspect of the Kents starts here, because before New Adventures of Superboy, when the Kents were around, they were not teaching Superboy anything because Clark knew what to do, or he figured it out on his own. And a lot of their involvement in the Silver Age was as comedic relief. Pa Kent trying to spank a steel, skinned baby Clark or young Clark and breaking his hand on it was not an uncommon kind of joke. And so, yeah, bringing them here as major players and supporting characters in Clark's life was a big shift for the character here.
1,000%. And I identify with everything you said as someone who grew up in that post-crisis era. The notion that he would fly home to the farm and get counsel from them whenever he needed it, it was so baked in, and you kind of take for granted that that's just a part of the mythology. And then you realize, no, that's not necessarily the case. And while I have not read to the extent that you have in terms of Pre-Crisis Superman, just in the selections of Golden and Silver Age Superboy specifically that I have read and that we've talked about, the Kents are there, right? Like they're physically present, but they're not taking on that more parental role, instilling those values, offering that guidance and that counsel that we would come to see. And then you get to this series and there it is. But, and this was the thing that I think I was surprised by this. There's another dynamic to it, which is they're not just here to give him a pep talk when he's feeling down on himself. They are essentially training him. There's very much this idea among the three of them that he is Superboy now. He is training to be a Superman. He will be Superman in the future. And so, again, it goes beyond just, they're offer, a shoulder for him to cry on or give him a talk, like we're used to kind of seeing more in the modern era. But here, there are very specific directives that they're issuing to him. There's a story early on where they're having breakfast and Clark is like, I understand why I have to eat when I'm at school to keep up appearances with my friends, but when it's just us, I don't need to eat physically. I don't need to. So why bother? And both of them come back like, no, like we don't know the full extent of your powers and what's needed and what's not. So you have to eat. There's another bit later on where Clark performs a save without first changing into his Superboy garb. And
they are appalled when that happens because anything could have happened. Anyone could have seen you. He's like, no one saw me. But there's a turn in that story where someone is really thorough in trying to figure out who saved them. And they're able to match up the mud prints with Clark's boot. And you're right. Jonathan and Martha are very much parenting him. And, before this series, since most of the Superman output is Superman comics. And during this version of the character, his parents have been dead since he was before college. So if their Kents are going to show up, it's only in Superboy stories. Of course, all of that changes with 1986, 1987 with the reboot. But you only get the Kents in Superboy. And whenever you have so many years where he wasn't even at home because he was always off with the Legion, you just didn't see his parents ever. So yeah, they would come in here and they parent him, they train him. It's the idea that was only ever given lip service, but theoretically was supposed to be there during the early Supergirl run, that she was living in that sad little orphanage because she was learning how to use her powers. And theoretically, Superman was supposed to be training her, but we never really saw that on the screen or on the page very much. They just did the orphanage thing until they decided to change it up. But here, yeah, one of the things that I remembered was that Superboy had to do a report on the launching of the Mercury missile, the one of the satellites we sent up into space before we did, manned rocket launches and moon trips and everything. And he ended up as 10-year-old Clark going out there and helping out as Superboy. And then he went home and wrote his paper about all of his experiences with the space mission and had his mom look over and she's like, this is a great paper. You also just gave away your secret identity because there's no way that a 10-year-old boy could know these things. Only Superboy could know them. And he just hadn't thought of that because he's a kid. So yeah, teaching and helping him and correcting his mistakes that he makes because he's just not collected the wisdom is a great element here.
Absolutely. A couple of other examples that kind of jumped out at me. There's a backup story where the Kents are adamant that Clark does not use his super speed to race through his homework assignments. They want him to complete tasks at a normal human speed, in large part because when he is an adult and he needs to continue and preserve a secret identity, he needs to be able to act in accordance with those around him. So there was that. There's a two-parter where Superboy builds this robot to test his abilities. He doesn't run it by the Kents first, and Jonathan is again pretty aghast when he first learns about this. So there are multiple instances. Another story towards the end of the issues that we looked at where we have a pair of Kryptonians who claim that they are Kal-El's biological parents. They're these criminals. And Clark and Jonathan have a rather heated debate about what to do with them, whether or not they should be banished to the Phantom Zone or dealt with in some other way. And we could talk more about that story. That one really jumped out at me. But hand in hand with sort of this ethical debate that they're having. There's also all of the emotion coming from Pa, Martha as well off on the side there about the fact that now there's this other set of parents in his life, criminals though they may be, and that's fueling a lot of this tension between them as well. So really, it's a very specific color for the Kents here where they are training him. And that's what I wasn't really expecting going into this, reading it for the first time. It kind of felt like versions of Alfred and Bruce Wayne that we've gotten in certain tellings. I think about the Gotham television show and maybe the Matt Reeves, the Batman, and even the Snyderverse to an extent that we don't see Bruce's upbringing. But like that version of Alfred, who's this tactical strategist, drill sergeant almost, the Kents here aren't necessarily in that exact same vein, but kind of shades of that. That's what I kept coming back to. It was really fascinating.
There's I'm not a religious person, but I do want to speak about a little element of the Christian story that this reminds me of. There is a line, it's only in one of the Gospels, where there's a well-known scene about young Jesus being found in the temple and everything. And after that story wraps, there's a line that says that he went out and grew in wisdom and stature. And it occurred to me once in my adult relationship with faith that if he grew in wisdom and stature, then he must have had less wisdom when he was younger in order to get more wise later. And I think with Superman, there is a common aversion to the idea that he might make mistakes, that he might have to figure something out. There's a tendency among viewers and readers to not want to see that with Superman because he's Superman. But if you have Superboy, then I think it makes it okay. It makes it okay for him to do stuff that's going to cause problems. It's going to be a trouble and something he really should not have done, and he can learn from the experience. Now, I personally, as a fan, am perfectly okay with the idea that a young Superman who's early in his career is definitely going to do stuff that maybe he wouldn't do later. And those kinds of stories, are perfectly valid, but that's a whole other, conversation. But to see Superboy here doing stuff where, maybe that's not the best idea, Clark. And by the end of the story, he figures out that maybe that's not the best idea. Like there's one point where he, while his parents are off on vacation, he makes a mistake as Superboy that ends up having bad consequences. And he gives up being Superboy and travels back to the past to live out his life where he can't harm anyone because he knows that according to DC editorial's time travel rules, you can't change history if you travel to the past. And his parents come home to find out that their son has quit being Superboy and abandoned them. And it's the kind of lesson that actually Jonathan Kent does teach Clark in the Batman v Superman, the idea that you can have these actions that you take to save someone that have unintended consequences that can hurt someone else. And Clark realizes in that story that all he can do is do his best in the moment. And if there are unintended consequences, he can try to deal with those as well. But the fact that saving one person might hurt someone else is not something he can take responsibility for. He can just do his best at the moment. And I think that was a very excellent lesson for him to learn in that story, because I was kind of expecting it to have an all happy ending. I'll just always save everybody kind of idea that is so often used to critique Superman films, but he didn't. He's like, I'll just do my best. That's all I can do.
Yeah, so I agree wholeheartedly with everything you just laid out. And that's really the other big picture takeaway I had from this reading as well, which is in looking at the Golden and Silver Age issues that I did. And again, I recognize I only looked at a selection, but still, while I enjoyed a lot of them, I still kept coming back to this idea that the Superboy we were being presented with really felt like a mini Superman. And he really seemed to have a lot figured out. And big picture, that's kind of been one of the central tensions that I've experienced just with the whole idea of Clark operating as Superboy, this feeling that it sort of short circuits that journey to becoming Superman. But I've been working my way through all of these discussions. But here, I finally saw what I think fans of Superboy have been pointing to. And on that note, I want to go to our Smallville mail sack for a second here, because I got a great email from one of our audience members. Shout out to Martin Gray. And this was part of
Martin.
his... Yeah, right on. Yeah, he's very active on Twitter/X. And he sent me this great email, and there's one portion in particular that I want to pull out here and read. And then this ties in really nicely to what we've been talking about. Martin says, and this is going back to our episode 150, where we kind of laid out sort of the arguments for and against Clark as Superboy. But Martin says, there was talk about the tension between Clark operating as Superboy and operating as Superman. I don't see that Superboy was operating at the same level as Superman. More often than not, he was learning the lessons that would enable him to become Superman. He wasn't the universally known and respected figure he quickly became as an adult. Superboy's adventures tended to take place around Smallville or off-Earth rather than on the national or international stage. I will push back a little bit on just the last part of that, because here, it's funny, in these issues that we looked at, it kind of goes both ways. There's one point where Superboy does make a remark about purposely avoiding operating in major cities, so fair enough. But at the same time, he routinely goes on these world patrols and is known, and Kennedy's got a direct line to him and this and that. So,
and when he's sitting in class, he'll jump out the window to go stop a forest fire 3 states away. So he does operate on a large scale. It's just he's primarily focused around Smallville, just like Superman is primarily focused around Metropolis.
Yes. Yeah. But
he just goes lots of other places sometimes.
But to Martin's main point here, what he's talking about as far as, again, Superboy not just being a mini Superman, I really saw that on display in this New Adventures of Superboy series. And I think that was something that I was longing for consciously or subconsciously. And these issues really kind of scratch that itch. There are a couple of really great examples of this. You mentioned one of them a moment ago, which I want to circle back to that story. But even earlier than that, there is an issue that features a young pre-inspector, Bill Henderson, who comes to Smallville to recruit Superboy to move to the big city of Metropolis. And there are a couple of interesting dynamics at play there. Certainly the main decision that Superboy is faced with, but also, and this ties back to what we've been talking about with the Kents are not keen on this idea of shutting down the general store and moving to Metropolis and Superboy taking on this larger role. Yet they don't just come right out and say, no, you can't do this. And that's kind of one of the things, the other pieces of the Kents that really jumped out at me, the level of trust and deference in a lot of respects that they afford Superboy. If he's not there when he's expected to be, they're always quick to say, well, there must have been something that came up. In that issue with Henderson, where he's faced with that decision, they don't like it, but they're open to entertaining it. So it felt like a very, mature dynamic among the three of them. And even though they are these, drill sergeants to an extent at points, they do still feel like this unit. And I like that relationship among the three of them.
It's an interesting balance that they're walking here, because they do have a son who is a teenager, but they also have a son whom they realize is going to be a savior, a world savior. He just has to get to adulthood first, and it's part of their job to get him there. So there's this balance they walk between correcting him when he needs it and trusting him to be operating on a much larger scope than they themselves can operate on. There are some parallels between that and regular child rearing, because you can't be there to have to make your kids choose the right thing. You have to teach them the value of the kinds of choices they should be making and trust that they're going to do it. And that's, that is kind of metaphorized here with them just trusting that on the super stuff, he has to make some choices, and all they can do is support him and help him and guide him.
Yeah, and I like and respect that space that they afford him in those instances. But in that issue with Henderson, in the climax of the story, there are these bank robbers that they're trying to nab, and Superboy decides to essentially get the drop on these guys, surprise them. But he does it because of this sense of adventure, right? And then it turns out after these guys have been apprehended that they had kryptonite bullets. Now, getting the drop on them, surprising them was the right move, but as Superboy concludes, should have been driven more by strategy, not a quest for adventure. And his conclusion, and the reason why he doesn't go back to Metropolis with Henderson, is he's not ready. That was a mistake that he made. And so that was an early instance in this run where I said, okay, like I get what Martin is saying here. I get what other fans have cited when they talk about, hey, Clark as Superboy, he's not Superman yet. He's not just a mini Superman. He's learning. And, going back to those letters pages, it was fascinating to take this kind of journey through time and see what fans were saying about these issues as they were coming out. And one of the things that came up in at least one of the letters that I saw was this feeling of, hey, we don't want Superboy to just be a mini Superman. So, even at that time, as this was coming out, I think that was something that was on fans' minds, at least to an extent. So, that was really cool. What did you think about the Henderson piece of this? Because it's not a flood of appearances from people he'll meet later in life, but there are a couple of instances. Perry White pops up as well. What do you think of the Henderson?
Yeah, there are a few. There's a Hal Jordan story. There's an Inspector Henderson story. There's a Perry White story. There's a Dr. Fate-ish supervillain. There's a Dr. Chaos, but I don't think that's actually a precursor to an actual character. I think it's just, playing in a world that Superman would understand. I really like that element of Superboy stories because it does give you a chance to sort of interact with younger versions of the characters. And I know I keep bringing more modern stories back to it, but I really feel like this series feeds so much of modern Superman in ways I hadn't expected. But one of the things that I think people tended to not like about Smallville is that all of these other heroes were getting their starts before Superman had even put on the suit. But the idea that a young pre-Superman Clark would interact with and inspire future DC heroes is a huge aspect of the later years of that show. And it was a major thing in Superboy. And it had definitely been done in earlier, eras. But the fact that they continued to do it here, I really, really enjoyed. And, we can imagine that Inspector Henderson, 5-10 years from now, when he finally sees Superman start to operate at Metropolis, he just smiles big. And, it's like he made it here eventually, and he could just be happy that things are working out now that the boy's grown up.
Exactly. You brought up Smallville, and we talk about Smallville all the time here because I love it so much. And certainly in the context of these discussions, I certainly have that in mind. And going back to that email from Martin, what I had written back to him before I had read these issues was that I think for me, when I talk about Superboy feeling like a mini Superman, or more specifically, like he's just got it all figured out, I think, I'm comparing him to the post-crisis version of the character. And when we've seen him in his pre-Superman days, particularly on the Smallville television show, or even though, of course, it came out pre-crisis, but skip the Superboy part, Superman the movie, when he's on the farm with Jonathan and Martha and he's not sure what direction to go in. That sort of struggle, that's what I wasn't, really seeing here. So I think that's what I was coming back to. But now that I've read these stories and I have a clearer sense, there is still a line. So that story with Henderson, Superboy is really hard on himself for something that I think most would say was not the most egregious mistake in the world. Like, he did the right thing. Right. It wasn't motivated by the right reason. Versus when I'm thinking about Smallville, and obviously a different medium, a different era, a different story, but still the things that he was struggling with there, we get to the conclusion of season 2. He destroys his ship. The explosion causes Martha to lose the baby that she was carrying. And he sees the look of disappointment and anger on his parents' faces. He willingly chooses to put on his red kryptonite ring, and he rides out of Smallville towards Metropolis on his motorcycle. He's going to go on this months-long bender where he's operating as Cal in the big city and ripping off banks and all this stuff. So all that to say, like, that's kind of what I have in my mind when I'm talking about a character who's really kind of figuring out his way and what direction he's going to go in. So what we get here doesn't come anywhere close to that level, but it is there, and it really went a long way.
It's the same theme. It's just very different story sensibilities.
Totally. Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina, for people of all ages and walks of life. With more than 40 years and a new second location to its name, Acme is a multiple-time Eisner Award nominee. The shop features a significant contemporary and vintage selection, as the Acme team uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available anywhere via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. So you brought up this other story, and I'm so glad you did, because this was another one that really jumped out at me. So that Henderson story was issue number 6. And then in issues 22 and 23, we get a little 2-parter here where the Kents are out of town. They're visiting, Fred and Mary or whatever out on the West Coast. And Superboy stops a volcano. He plugs it up with this giant rock, but inadvertently causes all of this pressure to have no place to go. And it ends up resulting in this tidal wave. And he's able to stop the tidal wave before it wipes out all of the inhabitants that are there. But he recognizes this mistake that he made. And then it sends him on this spiral. And he's thinking about other instances when he was saving people who were stuck in a cave-in and he inadvertently released these poisonous gases. And another time when he was coming back to Earth from space and he inadvertently let this glob monster follow him back. And then in the present, he's with Lana on this ride, and he has to switch to Superboy to make a save. And as Clark, he jumps out of the boat and doesn't realize while he's off performing his Superboy save that Lana, looking for Clark in the water, dives in after him and hits her head and almost dies. And so all of these things just snowball. And his conclusion is, and this is really the next level of that Henderson story, because here it's not just, oh, I'm not ready to be Superman yet. Here it's, I'm a liability and I need to remove myself from this situation entirely. And so he goes to the past, to the Old West. Like, he gives up his life entirely. He leaves the Kents a letter. This one was so striking to me. What was your take on it?
I just thought it was a huge... Kids react big to their own mistakes, especially if they have a strong, compass of wanting to do the right thing. And I felt this was the big example of that kind of a reaction, but on a super powered level. He's actually glad in the story that his parents aren't there to talk him out of it because he doesn't want them to. He feels like he's, basically a danger. He's a freak. It's the same. It's honestly not that dissimilar to the exile story for Superman, whenever he realizes that as Gangbuster, he's doing things he shouldn't be doing and he leaves Earth. It's a very similar story beat. And yeah, he just goes back in time. And I mentioned it earlier, but it kind of tickled me that he is totally taking advantage of DC editorials dictates on how time travel is going to work. He's like, if I go back in time, I know that I will not change history. I will not have an impact because that's how time travel works. So he goes back in time knowing that whatever he does, it's safe. It's already part of the timeline. And so he just goes back and lives his life. And we don't know how long he's back there, but I get the feeling it's weeks or months that he lives this life in the Old West. And eventually, he has to do super things. And I forget exactly how the lesson works out in his mind, but he realizes he can go back to the present day and be okay. I thought it was a very fun story. That just for the reasons I said, it's kind of unique.
It is. Yeah, ultimately, there's an alien that invades, and he has to fight off the alien. And then his takeaway is that whatever risk he might pose, it's outweighed by the good that he does. That's kind of the ultimate lesson that I think he gleans from this. I enjoyed this so much, and you're spot on where you talk about what a child's overreaction. So it's like the fact that he's messing up to begin with, and then the fact that he, arguably messes up, he overshoots the mark in his response to his mistakes. All of that does feel in keeping with a younger iteration of the character, not just a mini Superman. Only thing about this, the second part, I don't know, it lost me a little bit. When the Kents find this letter, they're upset. We only spend just a few panels with them, and I think Jonathan says something to the extent of like, "Well, we just have to pray for him now." It's like, that's it. I mean, but again, what else could they possibly do? I mean, I don't
really. There's it's 100% out of their hands, and of course, this is a pre-computer era. They can't even search for him out there, search for traces. They're literally just going to have to live their lives and think about the son they used to have, and it's. They don't spend any time on that aspect of the story, but it had to be very scary and sad for Jonathan and Martha. And although we don't see it on the page, they probably had a talk with him. Look, whatever you do, wherever you are, however you might be feeling in the moment, you can't just walk away from us. We love you too much. And frankly, you owe us, you owe us better treatment than to just disappear from our lives and leave a note. That's the conversation I would be having with him if I were his dad.
Yes. No, 1,000%.
One of the stories that I really enjoyed reading, I think, was a 2-part backup story. Because for those who don't know, this comic started whenever standard story length was 17 pages. And then a handful of issues in, they expanded it to 25 pages. But instead of extending the stories, they just started putting backups in. So you actually get 2 stories in the issues for a lot of the run. And so a lot of times the backups would be 2-parters because you get more story out that way. One of them was that Superboy did a high-speed trip or whatever, and finally and suddenly found himself in a different Smallville with different people and another version of Clark. And they don't say it on the page in the first half, and they only mention it maybe once on the page in the second half, but experienced readers will quickly figure out that he has just traveled to Earth 2 and is interacting with a young pre-Superman Clark Kent. So ostensibly the Clark Kent whose powers were much lesser. And I really liked that because, one, having Clark in the Golden Age interact with another version of himself who has powers, I just thought was a really neat idea. It introduces an idea that you can only at best try to read in between the lines, but the idea that Superman's powers increased because he pushed himself, that's never said in the Golden Age. His powers increased because the stories had ideas where suddenly he could do new things. His X-ray vision is introduced as if it had always been there the first time he uses it, that kind of a thing. But you could, looking at the era, say he, got stronger maybe because he just tried harder. And that's introduced here. And it's also reinforced later with stories like the Man of Steel film and stuff, where he can't fly until he just pushes himself past what he thought was his limits. But it's a fun story. You see John and Mary Kent, which were an early name for the Kent family. They have a different visual rendition because if you read any of the pre-1960, 1958 maybe, Superman comics where he remembers his parents look like they walked out of the American Gothic painting. That farmer and his wife painting that's really popular. His parents looked like that painting in the old Superman comics. It wasn't until the Silver Age was really starting that they integrated Superman's backstory with Superboy. Before that, they were 2 separate characters. And so seeing that continued here was neat. But yeah, what'd you think of that story?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I I thought that was interesting as well. And that's actually something that I don't know that we've said explicitly as we've been doing these episodes here. But yes, to your point, even though the character slash concept of Superboy is introduced in the Golden Age, by the time we're in the Silver Age, we have this bifurcation where the Earth 1 Superman, he's the one who had this past as Superboy. And the Earth 2 Superman is essentially the Golden Age version of the character who did not operate previously as Superboy. So during this portion of the pre-crisis era, we do have different versions. We have a Superman who was Superboy and we have a Superman who wasn't. And so having them interact was interesting. I guess I'm really getting nitpicky here. I was anticipating some sort of mind wipe of either or both of them, but particularly the Earth 2 Superman by the time we were done with the story. And that doesn't happen. And I don't know. It feels like short-circuiting his journey a little bit if he's had this interaction with an alternate version of himself in the costume who's doing all of these things. It felt like a little bit much for me, but overall I liked their interactions and it was cool to see that play out.
And the stories about how an Earth 2 Superman would have come into being Superman aren't really very detailed. A lot of that transitional period of his life is just glossed over due to the nature of the storytelling of the time. So where his costume came from, he treated it with chemicals in order to make it invulnerable. It's not Kryptonian cloth. He made it that way. And so the idea that he might have gotten the inspiration for his costume from having run into this other superpowered version of himself, I thought was kind of neat. There's a lot that you can sort of backplay into Earth 2 Superman's earlier life from this story. And it's okay because whenever there was no Earth 1, Earth 2, and it was just, this is the way Superman is, they didn't tell those stories of his early life. And when you got to Earth 1 and Earth 2 Superman, all of the early Superman stories were about Earth 1. So you don't get this exploration of how Earth 2 Superman came to be in the same way that we do the standard Earth 1 Superman.
Sure. Just in terms of a couple of other kind of big picture bits of business with all of this is another aspect that I don't think we've hit on specifically. It actually comes up in the letter column from the first or second issue of New Adventures of Superboy. The timing or the relationship of the timing between the Superboy comics of the day and the Superman comics of the day, the notion that at a certain point it was decided that there was sort of this 15-year lag, right? Like the Superboy comics were 15 years prior to the Superman stories, right?
And they're pretty consistent about that. Whatever year you're reading the comic in, subtract 15, and that's where it's taking place.
Right on. The other thing that overall, I think I take this as a positive. I feel like we see a shift with Lana Lang here, where the last time I checked in with the character in the Silver Age issues that we took a look at, she was very much the girl in his hair, the one who was constantly trying to prove that Clark was actually Superboy. Whereas here in this New Adventures of Superboy series, she very much seems to buy his quote unquote milksop act, that he's very timid and meek and mild. He sometimes drinks his milk too fast. He gets a stomach ache. He's got a headache. He's very frail. He's very delicate. Unless I skipped over this or was an issue that I didn't hit. I mean, there's nothing here that really plays into that more Silver Age trope of her constantly trying to prove he's Superboy or even suspecting it.
I think it's probably a choice on the part of either the writers or the editors to leave that trope behind, because it had its day, it had its play. Side note, Lana Lang was trying to prove that Clark was Superboy long before Lois got the idea that Clark might be Superman. It was very much a Lana Lang thing that they eventually started using for Lois as well. But the thing is that like in the 50s and 60s, Lana Lang was very often friends with Clark. There were often hints of romance. They would talk about going on dates occasionally, but at the very least, they were steadfast friends. And to go along with what you were saying about there being some sort of shift, you don't really get the feeling that Lana and Clark are steadfast friends. She seems to tolerate him at best. She doesn't dislike him necessarily, but she does get impatient with him. And she gets annoyed by his situations, and not in an, oh gosh, Clark, but more like a, okay, fine, whatever, I'll see you later kind of a thing. It feels a lot more, or a lot less at least, endearing in their relationship and more like an honest frustration on her part.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There's one bit that really stood out to me here. So we mentioned the issue where Clark performs a save without first switching into his Superboy uniform. And the man he saves is a wealthy guy, and he offers him $1 million reward. Just as a side note, that one was interesting because I thought that, I mean, I should have known better given just the time we're in and this version of the character and all that he's already learned from the Kents. But I thought we were going to have a little moment where, not that he would even want the money for himself, but that there would be some sort of, oh, hey, like I've been offered this reward. And then you have the Kents say, no, like that's not what this is about. But here he's already learned it, right? So he turns it down and tells the guy to donate it to charity. And then later he's talking to the Kents about it. And he's like, yeah, you taught me never to accept a reward for performing my feat. So like they've already handled that bit of business. But it just called to mind the pilot of Smallville, where Lex gives Clark this beautiful truck after Clark rescues him from the bridge. And Clark, is pretty happy to accept it. And then Jonathan is the one to step in and be like, because Clark says, well, I saved his life. And Jonathan's like, well, you think you deserve a prize? So again, I thought we might see that lesson be learned here, but it was already established, which is totally fine. But the reward thing was just sort of a side piece. But what was interesting with that issue, I thought by the end of it, there would be some sort of out for Clark. Like the Superboy says, oh no, I was flying by and I used my super breath. It wasn't actually Clark. Because the cover story that they go along with is that Clark had this surge of adrenaline in this moment of crisis. And that's how he was able to pull this guy's car.
Sort of a David Banner kind of moment. Yep.
Exactly. But I thought there was going to be an out by the end of it where it's like, oh no, Superboy used his breath and we're done with it. But that's not. We enter the next issue and everyone still thinks Clark had done this. And Lana's, you notice a little bit of a shift in terms of how she's regarding him. And then there's this car accident and these tigers are set loose. They were on the way to the circus. And Clark is, pretty active in that moment in trying to divert them. And he runs down an alley, I guess, to lead them away. And ultimately he is sort of able to put the genie back in the bottle with this meek and mild act, because after he does what he needs to as Superboy, he changes back to Clark and he hides under the car. He's scared. And that's where Lana finds him. And she's not particularly pleased with him, right? She thought he was brave now. I'm saying to myself, though, what did you want this guy to do? Like in that moment, it felt a little unfair. It's like, come on. But I thought that piece of it was interesting. But yeah, just noticing that shift in the character of Lana Lang was one of the big takeaways that I had. Not a lot of Lex Luthor in this run of issues that we looked at. Only a couple.
And that kind of tracks with the overall history. He only shows up as young Lex Luthor very occasionally in Superboy stories. They do the famous story that has the origin for the first time. And it's also the first time you actually get a first name for Lex. Before that, he's just Luthor throughout the 40s and 50s. And then this Adventure Comics issue in 1960 comes around that shows that Luthor knew Superman as a kid. And also his first name is Lex. But even after that origin story, he only shows up, occasionally in Superboy comics. So having only a story or two with him here tracks with that.
Yeah, and they were very consistent. Where in both instances, he, whether through an experiment or a device, messes with Superboy's powers. And one of them, he turns Superboy into this biomagnet, where he's able to pull things in with this new ability. And at first it's a major advantage, but then it goes too far and he has to divest himself of this ability. And then there's another one where Lex creates this power disruptor device that caused Superboy's powers to go awry. Like he offers to defrost the freezer for Martha, but the heat vision overdoes it and it engulfs it in flames. So they were very much hand in hand, those two stories. So yeah, not a ton of Lex in this. I want to talk just for a minute about the first issue of this series, which, famously has
birthday issue.
Yeah, the birthday issue, which has the typo
that doesn't
on the cover.
Really have a birthday in it.
That's the thing. Okay, so there was a typo on it where it says electrifying. Electrifying is misspelled. But I talked about this issue at the beginning of this event that we're doing here, because even though I've had really very limited experience with the concept of Clark as Superboy in my fan journey, I did buy a copy of the New Adventures of Superboy #1 in the back issue bins in the mid 90s. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, maybe I'm 8, 9, 10, somewhere around there. And to your point, it's this great cover for the first issue of Superboy celebrating his 16th birthday, and he's surrounded by the Kents and Lana and Pete and Chief Parker. But you read the story, and at the party, Clark, again, celebrating his 16th birthday, and there's this question about why is there an extra candle on the cake? And that launches us into what really comprises the vast, vast majority of the issue, which is this flashback to shortly after Superboy made his original debut as an 8-year-old. So the bulk of this story is young 8-year-old Superboy. And I got to be honest, this was one of my least favorite issues of the ones that we looked at. I think in part because if I'm more open to the idea of Clark as Superboy, it's as an older Clark, not the little 8-year-old boy that really feels like we're pushing it now. I'm not particularly keen on Super Baby or 8-year-old Superboy. That just feels like too much and too silly to me. But the reason I bring this up is that I feel like there's an alternate reality for me out there where the kickoff issue to this series was something different, something that would have grabbed my attention more. And if it had, this could have set me on a whole other path as a Superman fan. Because if that issue had really grabbed me, maybe then I would have kept digging through those back issue bins and gathered more of the series. I mean, it could have been a whole different ball game for me when it comes to Superboy. And I'm trying to, I don't have that much of a memory of my reaction to this as a kid, but I have to imagine, right? And I think people identify with this. I think especially when you're little, you want to see people a little bit ahead of you, right? It's why I was I still am, but a massive Power Rangers fan. And watching that as a little kid and seeing these teenagers who were a few years ahead of me was amazing. Then you get to a point where I think you maybe gravitate more towards people who are, kind of more in line with you. But as a kid, I think you kind of want to see people ahead. So I'm all of this to say that as a little boy, maybe the reason why this issue didn't grab me and why I didn't dig for more back issues was the idea of like 8-year-old Superboy didn't really do it for me. I don't know that this was an effective launch for the series. What did you think?
So the cover, I have to feel that Bates kind of found his footing for what he wanted to do with the series as he went through the first few issues, because the first few issues are not the strongest of the series at all. And for listeners out there, if you go to pick up this series and you want to read it, just be aware that it does not have the strongest start. And this is a good example. Like you said, it's not that strong a story. It does fall into that old school trope of put this crazy thing on the cover, and then it has just a very minor aspect to the actual story that it plays into. You see Clark celebrating his 16th birthday, and that is exactly 1.5 pages of the story before we flash back. Now, I can see how somebody might have thought it's the first issue of a Superboy series, so we should put the beginnings of Superboy into the story somehow. And so that ends up being what it's largely about, a very young 8-year-old Clark in the very first days of being Superboy. And then he runs into these cat-faced aliens and, shenanigans ensue. But it's a weird story. It's very contrived. It, barely justifies the cover. And it's all wiped from his mind at the end, which is a story trope that really, really doesn't need to be used unless there's some significant justification for it, because all stories should have consequence if you have an ongoing narrative about a character. So yeah, I do not love this issue either.
Yeah, it's tough. And I didn't want to lead off our discussion with it because I wanted to focus on more of the kind of the positive aspects of this, but it was kind of a rough start. And the thing I keep coming back to is I feel like the story would have been vastly more effective and would have tracked better if it had been about a 16-year-old Superboy as opposed to an 8-year-old Superboy. And it would have just been set in the present day of the comic. The basic setup, just for the audience, if people aren't familiar, is that you have this pair of aliens whose world succumbed to this plague, and they were able to create this serum to immunize themselves, but it essentially made them immortal by, long story short, changing their brain chemistry or something to that effect. And so they don't age, and they're out there for forever, and they're tired and bored, but they can't die. And so they want to extract Superboy's aging factor so that they'll be able to grow old and die. And he's powerful enough to withstand this, but the trade-off is that he will remain forever fixed as this 8-year-old boy. And again, kind of hand in hand with what we've been talking about with the Kents, they're not on board with this, but they also don't say, no, you can't do this. So they are seemingly open to respecting the decision that he makes, even though they clearly don't want him to do this. And at a certain point, it seems like he's done it, but then it turns out, because he's so savvy, this little 8-year-old Superboy, he's one step ahead, and it was all just a trick. Given that their brain chemistry had changed with the serum, his belief was that if they thought that they could age and die, that in fact they would. And that's what proves to be the case. As they're flying away, they're growing older. So again, it's a fine enough issue. I don't think it's the most captivating, especially compared to some of the other ones here. But the fact that it centered around this 8-year-old version of the character really just, like I said, I think made for a less dynamic opening to the series than we could have had. So again, I just kind of wonder what would have happened if we had had a different kickoff to the series back in the day. But that's the story that we had.
Yep. And like I said, it's worth giving the series more of a chance than just the first issue or two if you're wanting to read through it for the first time.
Absolutely. Now, I would say probably my favorite story out of the batch that we read comes from issues 8 and 9, where you have the trio of Phantom Zone criminals, Zod, Feora, and Jaxor, who use their telepathic abilities to make Jonathan and Martha forget that Clark is Superboy.
That was a strong story, and one of my favorite things I've read in a while from Superman, honestly, because it's harsh. And you don't know what's going on for a good while. Only the cover gives a hint of it. And yeah, go ahead, because I really enjoyed this one.
Yeah, this one was a standout. It takes a few turns that you really don't expect. So Superboy, once he realizes that this isn't a bit, that they actually don't remember that he's Superboy, he correctly surmises that it's a plot of some sort and that revealing himself to his parents might harm them in some way. Again, he really does not have the full picture here, but he knows enough to not reveal himself. And this really poses a complication. You come to realize, or I guess he comes to realize, how much harder it is to be Clark and Superboy without the backup of the Kents. For example, the principal calls the house and they're like, oh, Clark left after, third period. Is he homesick? And they're like, no, he's not here. So
right.
It's really proving problematic. And it gets to the point where Clark decides, I can't keep this up. Eventually they're going to figure this out. And then we're really going to be in danger because, again, his fear is that them finding out is going to harm, kill them, do something.
And also just the fact that he has no support and no coverage. Cause he can't, if he has to leave school and leave his Clark life to go be Superboy, his parents had his back. And now his parents don't have his back. So he's answerable to them for his, what would be considered for all other children, misbehavior and lacks of responsibilities and stuff. So yeah, he eventually decides that it's too much and he can't continue. And he decides to end his Clark existence. And it's a fantastically done scene because Pete Ross, as every long-term Superboy fan knows, Pete Ross has known his secret identity in secret ever since that one time they were out camping together. That one panel that you see redone like 50 times where he sees the flash of lightning and there's Clark changing Superboy. So he's with Clark and he sees Clark go overboard and Superboy pretends to not be able to save him. And Pete's very confused, but he's like, okay, Superboy, I guess Clark's dead. And it's just the mystery of what all is going on at this point is still completely untouched because this is in the first half of the story. And it's not till the cover of the second issue that you even get a hint that there's Phantom Zoners involved. But yeah, it was an intriguing story.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the tragedy of this is that he does have support in the form of Pete doesn't realize it. And That's one of the things that's been giving me so much more appreciation for Pete, the lengths that he goes to help his friend without revealing that he knows the secret. And I really felt for Pete. And honestly, I was a little annoyed at Clark. That's an awful lot to put on your best friend to make them think that you've died, right? Because he needs a witness, and he chooses Pete. Of course, he doesn't know that Pete knows he's Superboy. So as far as Clark is concerned, Pete is going to think that like Clark died on his watch while they were out, out canoeing together, seemingly vaporized by this geyser underwater. So I really felt for Pete in this. And once Clark's abandoned his identity, again, I think the story does a great job of showing the value and the importance of the Kents and of the Clark Kent identity to both the character of Superboy as well as to Superboy comics and the mythology overall. Because now, divorced from that civilian life, he's just patrolling. And it really comes to take its toll after a while. He even eventually comes to build a little hideout for himself in the Himalayas. It's a little precursor to the Fortress of Solitude. He creates a little space for himself. But, it's really weighing on him. So it again shows you the importance of being Clark and having those parents in his life. I thought the resolution to this was a little so-so, where essentially, as we find out later, there was a gemstone of some sort that was above the washing machine in this hidden compartment in the Kent house. And that interfered with the telepathy that the Phantom Zoners were exerting over the Kents, and that allowed them to remember. And then they set a fire to the house to draw Superboy in to save them. And they also, as backup, they place pouches, right, of his clothes, the way that he does on their person, so that he'll see and recognize that they now once again know that he's Superboy. So again, I felt like the resolution was a little
bit contrived. You are correct. I enjoyed seeing the three Phantom Zoners because this is, one of they don't get used a whole lot in the Superman stories, but so this is one of the first times they got used after Superman the movie. And for those who don't know, before Superman the movie, the foremost Phantom Zone criminal was Jack Sur. And Zod was a third or fourth tier Phantom Zone character. He was always in the background of the group, not the foreground. Then Superman the movie happens, Zod happens, and now in this story of the three, Zod is in the front, and Jack Sur is more acting like his henchman. Of course, we haven't gotten Superman 2 yet, so we haven't seen all that's going to happen with that. But I think it's on the horizon when this comes out, because this was May of 1980, and I think Superman 2 came out in 1980. But yeah, other than the contrived ending, I really, really dug the story.
Yeah. Real quick, as we wind down here, there's a two-parter early on where this former classmate of Clark's in the present day DCU, Joe Silver, who's this dream scientist, he's able to project his astral form into his past self's body and tries to redo his life and emerge in Smallville as this superhero Astrolad. This is far from the most important thing about this story, but it just made me laugh, where in the present day, Joe was looking at his old yearbook, and apparently Joe Silver was voted Mr. Inferiority Complex, and Clark Kent was voted Mr. Meek and Mild. And that felt as cruel as kids can be for the school yearbook to list that. Really felt like a bridge too far.
Yeah. Weirdly enough, Astrolad has been used again in alternate timeline stories in more recent years. I haven't read them yet, but I did see someone mentioned one of the Justice League, the Nail, not the Nail itself, but like the sequel to the Nail. He just shows up as an adult member of that timeline's league. So it's weird that somewhere in that creative process, somebody remembered this old Adventures of Superboy story.
Yeah, it's been so long since I've revisited that. I had no memory. I'll keep an eye out the next time I read that. There's another one where you find out that Jonathan and Martha had fostered this troubled youth years earlier for a few months, and we catch up with them, in the present day Superboy story, and it seems like he's defected to Russia, but then it turns out he's a double agent working for the CIA, so that had a happy ending there. And then kind of on a related note, there's another story where there's this couple who wants to adopt Superboy and place Lana and Clark in danger to try to draw Superboy out, ultimately realize the folly of their ways. But Just again, a couple of stories dealing with this. Uh, Again, another child that the Kents had taken in, and then this other story of someone trying to adopt Superboy.
And the story you mentioned early in the episode about the Kryptonian criminals who show up and try to uh, convince Superboy that they're really his parents. I felt like that was playing into, because there are some battles between them and Superboy, and I kind of feel like they were taking cues from Superman 2 whenever they were making that story. It felt like some of the same concepts of, Superboy fighting Kryptonian criminals. And they make a few points in there that will be revisited in Man of Steel about the idea that, you know, a Kryptonian brand new to the planet would not have as much control over their powers as someone who had grown up there. And the man in that particular couple is like, oh, I still think I could take him, which Zod does in Man of Steel. But yeah, lots and lots of good stories.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say about that two-parter and this run overall, because this is something that pops up a few times, the way that pair of Kryptonian criminals, they're able to convince Superboy that they're his biological parents and that there were criminals who were fleeing Krypton, but they had this baby and they decided to leave him on the doorstep of Jor-El and Lara. Superboy buys this because he uses the mind-probing ray, right, to recall his earlier childhood memories, and that memory is there. And then, of course, it turns out that was an artificial memory they had implanted. But I just bring it up because over the course of this podcast, we've talked a lot about the various tellings of the origin and how does Clark learn where he's from. And, I know we're in this era now where he has total recall and is able to remember these early events. And I know he loses some of those memories due to kryptonite exposure and then uses the mind probing ray to try to recover them. So that aspect of it just kind of jumped out at me. But yeah, I thought that was a fascinating two-parter. I think mostly because of that tension, that scene that I was talking about before between Clark and Pa and determining what do you do with these people. So that was a standout one for sure as well.
The Mind Prober Ray is an interesting plot device because it makes up this idea that Superboy has kryptonite-infused holes in his memory, but he uses it as a justification for having Superboy revisit eras in his life so he can tell stories about it. It's really just a plot device to get us to get to tell Super Baby stories and other such young Superboy stories. And so it works well in that regard. And then whenever they can use it in new and different ways, like in this story, it just gives that what started as a plot device more actual narrative weight.
Yes, absolutely. Well, listen, John, it was great to be able to compare notes with you. I appreciate you going through those issues and sharing all of your insight. And
it was a great time revisiting that era because, it's been a few years since I've read them. And because I recorded the Superman in Crisis podcast in late 21. So all of my pre-crisis Superman reading was from before that. And I released that podcast over the course of 22 and 23, which for those who don't know, that is a journey through the Superman issues from the beginning of Crisis on Infinite Earths through to the end of pre-crisis Superman with whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow. And I released those episodes at the pace that the comics came out. So it took about 18 months to go through 18 months of comics. But yeah, so all that to say, it's been a bit since I had read these. It was a really fun revisit.
Right on. Well, I thank you so much. I encourage everyone to follow you, John Reads Comics, on social media. Listen to John Reads Comics on all major podcast platforms. Anything in particular you want to mention or plug or direct people to?
I'm not doing a whole lot of Superman podcasting these days. I've thought about ways I could get back to that. I'm not doing it so much now. I do have so there are two ongoing concerns I'm putting out on a regular basis. One is comics related, and that is Ninjas and Bots. It's not Superman, but IDW put out some great comic books for the Ninja Turtles and the Transformers. And so my friend Lane and I alternate weeks. One week we cover some Transformers stories. One week we cover some Ninja Turtle stories as we work through the IDW comic book series for those characters. And that comes out every week. And then also kind of every week, Blaine Dowler and I are going through the classic 90s science fiction drama Babylon 5. And we're doing that on a show called Babylon 5 30 Years Later, where we're releasing our coverage of each episode exactly 30 years after it aired in the 1990s. So we are in the middle of season 1 of that show because that season aired in 1994, and here we are in 2024. So those are both available at John Reads Comics. They also have their own feeds under their own names, Ninjas and Bots and Babylon 5 30 Years Later. And all of my past endeavors are also available at John Reads Comics, the podcast feed or the website. There is no H in John.
Awesome. Well, I hope everyone will check that out. Folks, don't go anywhere. We're not done with the New Adventures of Superboy just yet. Right after this break, Rob O'Connor from the All-Star Superfan podcast will tag in, and we will discuss the second half of the series written by Paul Kupperberg. We'll be right back. We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. This episode made possible in part by educator, hobby comic book collector, and pop culture enthusiast Sam Lim. Sam is based in the South Jersey area and is looking to connect with other comics fans as well as retailers. They're also looking for comic shops to explore, so recommendations are welcome. Be sure to follow Sam on Instagram at SZL Comics to see their latest comic pickups and shop adventures. Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of two of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. And now, joining me to discuss the Paul Kupperberg written run on the New Adventures of Superboy is one of the hosts of the All-Star Superfan podcast, returning guest Rob O'Connor. Welcome back.
Superboy. Delighted to be back. Always love talking about this very, very important but slightly strange chapter in Superman's history.
Very much. But I have to say, continuing the thread from the first half of this episode, now that I've completed my reading of this New Adventures of Superboy series, what a treat. What a delight. I'll reiterate what I said previously. I really feel like this is an overlooked gem in the Superman, Superboy mythology. I really had a great time with this run of issues. What is your experience, your history with this series? Either the Carrie Bates run that we talked about previously or the Kupperberg run we're talking about now.
My history is probably similar to yours and a lot of the people around our age, in that I grew up with Superman the movie, John Byrne, Superman the animated series, Lois and Clark, where it was Clark as a young man in Smallville, and then he becomes Superman, and that's that. And then I was in a used bookshop one time. I think I was around 7 or 8 years old, and I found a comic called The New Adventures of Superboy. It was issue 5, and it had Superboy on the cover holding up his cape, deflecting a blast from an alien UFO or something. And I thought, wow, cool, amazing. And at this point in time, I was still living in the suburbs of Dublin. It was hard to come by American comics. So this was one of the first Superman-ish comics I ever owned. And I remember bringing it home and being like, Mom, look, I finally got a Superman comic. And she was like, that says Superboy. And it was through this comic that I guess I must have pieced together in my mind that at some point or another, there was a version of Superman where he was Superboy as a teenager. Because I also owned another comic, which was, I forget which issue it is exactly, but it's the comic immediately before Lois and Clark get married, where Lois climbs the mountain. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Yes.
And Superman has lost his powers in that issue, and he recounts his origin. And I know this because Michael Bailey tweeted it the other week, and it kind of, and he made the point that they recount the John Byrne rebooted origin in that comic because they must have thought, okay, well, there's going to be a whole lot of new readers coming on board for the wedding, so we need to do this. So I had both of these comics as a 7 or an 8-year-old, and I think it must have just struck me in my mind that, okay, well, obviously this was the status quo, and then in the intervening years, they must have changed it somehow. So for years then, that was my only kind of experience with Superboy as a concept. And then I think forums and the internet and all that came later on, and then the TV show. Eventually, I learned about that. But for a long time, it was really just an oddity. In the internet years, then when I did discover the TV show and all that sort of stuff, I did find myself wanting to go back and read more of these stories. And at that point, I did, and I read back on kind of the New Adventures of Superboy, and especially the tie-in comic for the TV show, which you should definitely check out. Even just as a Superboy comic in and of itself, it's a really interesting read. And what I found was that while this will never be my preferred version of the status quo, there is a certain charm. The same way, like Spider-Man, fighting crime as a teenager and dealing with teenage problems, there is like absolutely a charm to that. And obviously we grew up with Smallville and all that kind of stuff, but like Smallville was very much a half measure in that he's not wearing a costume for any of that. Whereas this, it's like he's full-fledged Superboy, but he's also a teenager and he's dealing with similar problems to Clark on the TV show. Now, going back to it now as a 34-year-old, I'm finding out that, well, actually, no, he's not really a teenager though. He's kind of just Superman transplanted into a teenager's body. And we can talk about that a little bit more, but I don't think they ever really went far enough with it. And I don't know if that's been your experience with it, but definitely the comics I've read, which admittedly aren't probably as many as you have, but I find that they didn't really push the concept of a teenage, untried, untested Superman. They didn't push that far enough. But I'm still so glad that there is such a wealth of material that exists where Clark is like a full-fledged superhero as a teenager. I think that's fascinating. So very long-winded answer there, but
no, I appreciate getting your take. And yes, I think we do have similar experiences. And like yourself, where I kind of am now and where I think I'm ultimately going to land by the time this is all said and done, would I need every iteration of Superman to incorporate Clark as Superboy? No, probably not. But charm is a great word. I think there's definitely an appeal to these kinds of stories. And still kind of letting this marinate a little bit, but I think one of the other ideas that I come around to is that I do genuinely think there is an opportunity to tell these kinds of stories in this kind of setting with Clark as Superboy through a modern storytelling lens with modern storytelling sensibilities, like we've gotten in so many other instances. And I look at something like the Mark Waid and Dan Mora World's Finest series, where it has this throwback feel to it, but it still feels fresh and current, and it's a great blend. And I think were something like that to be done with Clark as Superboy, I think there's a lot of potential. I think you're right. When we look back at these stories, there is a bit of a limitation there, although, and we talked about this in the first half of the episode, there are certain issues from that Carrie Bates run in particular that do get at what we're talking about when we kind of want to see it pushed and want to see the young hero struggling. So it is there, not to the extent that maybe you and I would want, but there is some of that. But there's so much potential.
I was thinking about this as well. I was going to get to this later on, but what I would really love is a kind of like an ultimate Spider-Man type book where it's set in its own universe completely, and Clark becomes Superman. Call him Superman, call him Superboy as a teenager, and it's just a completely no holds barred, anything can happen kind of off the wall reboot type situation where it's not connected to the mainstream universe at all, and it follows his adventures in linear time, and it sort of charts the progression of this very different, because it would result in a very different Superman, if he was doing this from the time that he was, 16, or in the case of the Silver Age, 8 years old. Like if he was doing that, he would be such a different individual to the guy we know in the mainstream comics. And I'd love a series to kind of chart that, sort of like that Spider-Man life story comic they did. I'd love something like that. Whereas I think the problem I have with Superboy as a concept, and I think you've mentioned this as well, all the versions of Superman I grew up with, his origin is like a really big deal. Like not just Christopher Reeve and the TV show, but like going back as far as George Reeves, like when he decides to take on this mantle, it's like a momentous thing in his life. It's the culmination of his journey as a man and his development and his self-reflection and all these kinds of things. And when you just change that so it's just he's an 8-year-old boy and he decides one day to be, it doesn't have anywhere near the same amount of impact or pathos or anything to it that I think I really like about Superman. And I think I really loved your episode with, I think, Chris from Superboy Beyond. He made the point that, well, you know, Superboy, it's his training period, and he needs to learn how to become Superman. And I don't really get that from these issues. It feels like he just has all the answers already, and it just isn't as interesting, you know?
That's the thing. And I think I'm really pinning a lot on a few of the issues from the Carrie Bates run, but they did go a long way towards showing me that training, but still they're kind of few and far between in the grand scheme of things. But what you hit on about the importance of the origin story and that stepping forward and becoming Superman, and this has come up in virtually every episode because this has been the biggest pressure point for me. And that's why, and just to kind of let the audience know where we're going with this, next week you'll be back. We're going to be talking about Superman, The Secret Years, the 4-issue miniseries that chronicles Clark's junior year in college at Metropolis University and bridges that time between Smallville and Metropolis as Superman working at the Daily Planet. And maybe we could talk more about it then. But I think that story accomplishes a lot. I still kind of come back to this idea of I would love to see that updated, expanded, retold. Because I think, and I don't know that I felt this at the beginning of this event, but I feel this now where I think there is a story that could be told that could kind of tie all of this together in a way that it reconciles the tension that you and I and other people have hit on. So more and more, this idea of potential, I just keep coming back to this. But in any event, for now, here we are looking at the Paul Kupperberg written run on New Adventures of Superboy. We had a couple of fill-in issues written by Bob Rozakis. He'll be back when we talk about Superman, The Secret Years. But he wrote issues 34 and 35 after Carrie Bates left the title. Those issues dealt with Yellow Perry, which I know you want to talk about. It ties into the Superboy TV show. I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, all of the issues through 54 are written by Paul Kupperberg, with the exception of number 51, which, again, will be part of our Superman, The Secret Years discussion next week. And on the art side, once again, we have Kurt Schaffenberger drawing all but the Sunburst 3-parter that comes pretty deep into this run. And according to the letters pages, he had a heart attack. I think that's why he wasn't there for those few issues. The letters pages, I mentioned this earlier, I bought this entire series in single issue form on eBay. And so I have all the single issues, which is really cool. You get the smell, you got the ads, you got the letters pages. And, you know, they mentioned with Carrie Bates, he had stepped away, at least in part because he was off consulting on Superman 3 at this time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Who knew?
That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, we knew he was doing that, but the fact that coincided with his departing the title was pretty interesting. So in the second half of the New Adventures of Superboy, let me just share kind of my overall big picture take, and then I want to toss it to you. So I enjoyed these issues a lot. I think for me, I enjoyed the A story or the main plots of the Carrie Bates issues a bit more than I did here. However, where these issues shine and where I really enjoy this was the use of the supporting cast and the subplots. You know, you mentioned Spider-Man a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
It started to have, and this will continue when we get into the Secret Years next week, a bit more of that Spider-Man-esque feel. And I feel like the supporting cast was really developing into this bit of a gang, like with Lana and Bash Bashford and Pete Ross and
Bashford.
Clark Kent gets a girlfriend, Lisa Davis. We also have this amazing subplot that fans of Smallville, I think, will really latch on to, where you have Jonathan Kent running for city council to stop this land deal that will result in a shopping mall being built right outside the town, which will hurt all of the local businesses. So that's the thing. On a story-to-story basis, or specifically the plots of a lot of these issues, I didn't get a ton of mileage out of them. They were solid. They were entertaining. But it was the subplots and the supporting cast where I thought this was phenomenal. What was your reaction to these?
I'm right there with you, to be honest. I actually wrote that down. I was like, there's a bit of a disconnect between the Superboy A plot and then the Clark Kent B plot. And I sometimes wished that they diverge a little bit more, which obviously was the case in Spider-Man. Like that's what's so great about those comics, which were nearly 20 years old at this point. And this is definitely trying to be Spider-Man in that way. It's trying to dial up the teen drama and stuff, but you get the sense that maybe they were worried of going too far, so that they limited that to just a couple of pages, and then the rest of it was all Superboy action, But I did find myself going, no, let's go back to Jonathan Kent there. I want to hear more about this, you know?
No, that's the thing, like 1,000%. There were a few issues, just to share for the audience. I don't know about yourself. You and I talked about kind of cherry picking some issues. So I ended up reading almost all of them. There were a few that I kind of skipped or skimmed, but even in those skims, I found myself, for example, that Sunburst 3-parter. That was one that I did not pour over, but I still was flipping through. And anytime I got to one of the subplots, specifically with Jonathan Kent running for city council or anything to do with Clark and Lisa, I stopped and I read those pages. And that was not something I could say about the first half of this run, for example. So, yeah, I mean, there was something that really grabbed me. It had that Spider-Man-esque feel, but the other thing that it called to mind was the Triangle era comics.
Oh, yeah. Big
with
time.
The supporting cast and those subplots. I mean, that was the secret sauce of that time. And we're only dealing with one title here, one monthly book, but still, like, it had that feel to it. And I felt very at home.
Yeah. And I think we did a John Byrne episode that'll be out by the time this goes out. But one of the main things I think they brought over from the whole Superboy idea was the idea of the Kents being alive and giving him support and guidance and advice and all that kind of stuff. And Jonathan Kent in these comics is amazing. Like, it's great. It's such a wonderful presence having him there. And you can easily tell why they must have gone, that's the one part of this that really, really works. And we need to carry that over into the main books, you know? But yeah, just that there wasn't enough, but that was my only complaint. Lisa Davis, man, this is my first ever encounter with that character. And, you know, Smallville, the series, borrowed a lot from Superboy, the concept. Where's Lisa Davis in that show? You know, like, what's the need? Why did they create Chloe when they could have just carried over Lisa Davis and called anyway?
I know we have this sweet, nice blonde girl named Lisa who shows an interest in Clark. There's an issue where he asks out the most popular girl in school to the dance, and she literally flat out laughs in his face. God. It's so cruel. And then you have poor Lisa there, just hoping that he'll ask her, and eventually barely works up the nerve to spit out the words. And she accepts, and they embark on this early tentative relationship, and it sparks a bit of jealousy in Lana Lang, who at one point says, I thought Clark and I had an understanding, which
oh my God.
I was a little frustrated at Lana in those issues. I won't lie.
I hate doing this, but I hate kind of ragging, especially on female characters, because it's something that happens in fandom far too often. Like, you know, but Lana is just hateful in these comics. So she's really just a nasty, vindictive person. And she just decides that she likes Clark once she sees that he's got this lovely, you know, girlfriend and he isn't giving her as much attention anymore. So she starts trying to ruin his life. It's just crazy.
Yeah. You know, it's the sort of thing where, and again, it's easy for us to say this in 2024, but it would have been more interesting and nuanced if they had done this. But if they had played it more that Lana felt left out or left behind because her best friend was spending so much time with someone, I think there might have been a little more validity to that. We might have had an easier time kind of buying into her point of view on this. But the fact that it so quickly became, maybe there are these romantic feelings that I have never seen Clark in this way. And it's the sort of thing where it's not beyond the realm of possibility. I mean, I think we've all lived through dynamics like this. So I'm not saying, it makes no sense, but yeah, she doesn't come off great in this, especially given how she had treated Clark. At this point, it's not like her treatment of him in the preceding issues is as awful as it has been. And we're way past the territory now of her trying to prove that Clark is Superboy. I mean, she seems to have fully bought his act that he's this milksop and whatnot. But still, it's not the warmest dynamic. And so when then it suddenly turns to jealousy, again, there is an element that does ring true, but yeah, I wish they had gone with a little bit of a different angle on that.
It's not hard that she's fully bought the disguise, given that Clark has an array of Superboy robots that he can use. Like, I know that was a thing in the Silver Age, that Superman had robots that he would use to throw people off the scent and all that. But Superboy shouldn't have those. Those should be a thing that only Superman has. You know, that's a perfect example of what I mean.
I've always had a hard time with the robots. Even just kind of surrendering myself to these Silver Age tropes. But I agree with you. If I'm going to buy it at all, I can buy it from Superman. Yeah. The Superboy side is really pushing things a lot. But anyway, again, this romantic development and then everything with Jonathan Kent and the city council, that really just puts a lot of meat on the bone here. and I think really elevates these issues to another level. I guess before we get deeper into the Paul Kupperberg era of this title here, we did have this two-parter that Bob Rozakis wrote in between the two runs that introduced the character of Yellow Perry, who would then get a spin on the Superboy television show. I guess this was one that stood out to you.
Yeah, and being perfectly honest, the only reason it stood out to me was because of Yellow Perry and her later appearance in the show. To my knowledge, this is literally the first appearance of Yellow Perry. And if I'm not mistaken, Yellow Perry is one of the only, possibly the only Superboy specific villain who shows up on the TV show. So what I mean by that is a villain that only existed in Superboy comics, as opposed to Superman as well, like Bizarro, Metallo, Lex Luthor, and all that sort of stuff. I just think it's very interesting, and you can definitely not only can you see similarities between this comic and later the Smallville series, but you can definitely chart a lot of key similarities between this comic in particular and the Superboy show, which would happen not that long after this. And I suspect that they were probably using this comic as and definitely Superman the Secret Years in a big way. I'd say they were using those as kind of their kind of their guidebooks, as it were, you know, because prior to this, then you just have a load of Legion of Superhero comics, and then like distantly in the Silver Age, then you have other Superboy comics. So it makes sense that they would be looking to these for inspiration for stories and stuff like that. Definitely not one of the best issues. I just thought it warranted a mention.
Yeah, this young woman who develops these magical powers, and I mean, ultimately, I think is well intentioned, but the magic tends to go awry. Like, she's a part of this carnival, and the generator goes out, and she wants to provide light, so she essentially summons a comet, but then it's going to crash, and Superboy has to try to stop it. So, you know, that was kind of the gist of it. It's an interesting point, though, about how specific this villain is. Especially in relation to the television show. And I think you're right. I mean, Kryptonite Kid, right, is one who debuted in Superboy comics, but then we had Kryptonite Man with Superman.
Yeah.
So I think you're right in terms of a villain who, you know, debuted in Superboy comics and only appeared in Superboy comics and then showed up on the television series. I think I guess two quick takeaways. One was, unlike the television show where the woman was obsessed with Superboy, right here, that's not the track at all. So that was a little bit of a different spin. But then going back to the role of the Kens, there's a whole discussion here about what could or would Superboy do if he has to fight a girl?
Huh.
And I love how it's Martha who's like, listen, you have to defend yourself. Like, you do what you need to do. So yeah, I mean, you get to see the role of the Kens in that respect. And that was, yeah, I mean, that was the big discussion with this one is like, what would he do? He can't hit a girl.
Love it. The concept of like magic and kind of mind-based villains comes up a lot in this series as well. I guess they were trying to, you know, talking about the triangle era and how, you know, Superman was depowered in that. So there was a lot more physical adversaries that he would come up against. There's a lot of kind of attempts to subvert Superboy's invulnerability in this comic in a good way, by the way. Like they find exciting ways for him to really throw down with people, as opposed to, you know, a lot of sort of Silver Age and Bronze Age stuff where he's just so impossibly powerful that there's nothing that can stop him. And I think Yellow Perry's a pretty good example of that.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I want to just kind of circle back to an idea that's come up on the podcast and on social media a bunch of times, and specifically comments by a comic creator whose work we enjoy. We've both had him on our shows, but Mark Waid, right? And Mark Waid has talked about how his preferred version of the character does not have Ma and Pa alive. And the example that he gave to me, and I know he said elsewhere, is that he doesn't like the idea and feels like it infantilizes Clark if he goes to Jonathan for advice on how to fight Brainiac, right? And my response in my head and in other conversations has always been, sure, but in terms of what we're seeing, that's not the kind of advice that he's seeking out. It's always more of the moral support, the guidance, the motivation that he needs, not tactical, strategic advice on how to do battle. And in the modern era, all the stories that you and I grew up with, and even in the pre-crisis era, looking at something like Superman the movie, right? I think all of that holds true. But I don't know, to Wade's point, and maybe why he feels that way a little bit, when you look at stories like this, I think you get a blend of kinds of support that the Kents offer, but there is that more practical aspect of this. Like, I got to fight this girl magician. What do I do? And so to whatever extent that's feeding into his opinion on that, I still don't agree. I love the Kents being alive, but I actually do have, I think, a better understanding maybe of where he and others might be coming from on that respect. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. All right. I suppose whenever he says that, I'm always like, why does it infantilize him? You know, why is it that we can't ask our parents for advice? Like, it just seems like such a throwback concept that, you know, an adult man can't come to, you know, his older guardians for advice on the world, you know, that kind of way. And I think it's like a positive reflection on how we've changed as a society, that we don't view our parents and the advice they give us that way anymore. I think, and it's strange to hear him every time he says it. I'm like, Mark Waid, you're not that old. I don't know. I deeply respect his work, but that's the only thing I keep coming up against, that he thinks that, and the reason that he thinks that, it just seems odd, you know. And I'm reading these comics, I'm just like, yeah, this works, and I'm glad they kept it, and I'm glad that even when they got rid of it again, they circled back and brought the Kents back alive after Rebirth, and like, they were still dead in Rebirth, weren't they? And then they came back again after that.
Yes. Yeah, because in Rebirth, there was that Reborn storyline that essentially merged the post-Crisis and New 52 versions of Superman. And I would say like 95% of the post-Crisis history was intact, but in keeping with the New 52, the Kents were dead. But then after Doomsday Clock, that's when Jonathan and Martha were back. No, that's the thing. I don't disagree, and it doesn't change the way I feel about wanting Jonathan and Martha alive. But I do bring it up just to say that I guess I do feel like I have maybe more of an understanding of what's fueling that opinion that he's expressed. And so I'm glad to at least have that for whatever that's worth. So then we get into the Paul Kupperberg issues here. I would say there's a fair amount of mental powers. We get this two-parter with the teacher, William Wright, who essentially can harness the willpower of others, and whatever he thinks becomes real. And to defeat him, Superboy has to believe harder, essentially. And then there's another three-parter later with a classmate, Johnny Weber, who gets hit with this cosmic dust comprised of red kryptonite and a mystery element, and it gives him psychokinetic powers. Side note, I'm in the midst of my Superboy TV watching, and we have the whole Darla Goes Ballistic episode, which was a lot of fun, and there she has psychokinesis, big thing here. And Superboy, to defeat him, has to use his heat vision to burn off the mystery element, and that at least, maybe not fully, but at least mostly negates the powers. But anyway, the two-parter with William Wright and then the three-parter with Johnny Weber, a lot with the mental powers.
You forgot to mention how exactly Dynamind gets his cosmic dust powers, by the way, because I thought this really stood out to me.
Go for it.
He gets them in a meteor shower where he gets doused with red kryptonite dust. Do you reckon the Smallville producers have read this comic, or is that a complete coincidence?
I would be shocked if they had read they read this series, and especially this 3-issue arc. You never know. But I kind of doubt it. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It does come as a result of this meteor shower. These connection points, intended or not, are always fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So and a lot of this is just sort of similar ideas, same types of creatives working on the same types of stories. You're going to have similar stories come to life. But I did think that was great. I really liked those 3 issues with Dynamind. I forget his civilian identity, but he's basically a pal of, well, not a pal, but he's a schoolmate of Clark and Pete and Lana's, who gets these powers, and he does all these criminal acts. And then when Superboy catches up to him, he pretends that it was just the effects of the red kryptonite. They made me evil, and I didn't choose to do any of this. And then he comes back the following issue, and he goes back to his wicked ways again. And Superboy, by the end of the issue, he outsmarts him and realizes that, oh no, it was you consciously doing this the whole time. Again, somewhat not a million miles away from some of the kind of meteor freak stuff you'd see on Smallville, where it's like, well, maybe it's affecting their minds as well, or maybe not. Maybe they just are evil. I thought that was cool. But what I really liked about that character was, unlike Lex Luthor, who shows up from time to time in this series and is always kind of relegated to the Superboy A plot and has nothing to do with the Clark Kent side of stuff, this character kind of intersected both sides of it, which was really, really interesting and felt more like the kinds of Lex Luthor stuff we saw on Smallville later on, where it's like, he was interacting with Lana and he was interacting with the whole gang, and then he was doing all this evil stuff on the side, and it just made the story more interesting. And in fact, much later on, he comes back and he kind of has a little bit of a redemption arc, which was really lovely. And Clark kind of stands up for him, and it was just really nice kind of Superman stuff. And we unfortunately don't get a lot of that with Lex Luthor in this comic, but it was nice to see similar types of stuff with this other character.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. The redemption of Johnny was a very unexpected but pleasantly surprising development. And yeah, you have Clark and the other guys as well, Pete and even Bashford standing up for Johnny when he wants to play football with them. And at least one of the other guys is like, no, he's a criminal. Get him out of here. I mean, the fact that after all of this, he ended up only getting probation. It's like, okay, but we'll go with it. I guess Superboy put in a good word for him. But he does have this redemption. And there's an issue that we didn't officially put on our list, but this was one that I did at least skim through, the Zatara issue. And that's where it turns out he's still got some residual power left. And he uses it to help Superboy without Superboy knowing. It's very Pete Ross of him.
Oh, cool. I haven't read that one.
Yeah. Again, I just kind of skimmed through it, but I was flipping through and I saw him and I was like, oh, what's this deal? So, this is a character that ultimately, only kind of goes so far because then the series ends and then we have Crisis on Infinite Earths and all that. But yeah, but your point is a fantastic one. And I do wish that Lex had gotten this kind of treatment or had been involved in this way. I mean, it's one of these things that as I've expanded my horizons and delving into the pre-crisis comics and all of that, it's like, oh, wow. There was this time where they had this past in Smallville and they were friends. They were friends for like 2 pages, right? Before everything went awry. And then mostly when we see Lex, and we don't see him a lot. I mean, in these issues that we looked at, I think he really only pops up 2 or 3 times. And it's always he's breaking out of the Soames Reform School and hatching one of his plots, and Superboy stops him. And I agree with you. I think were you to see him integrated into these stories on both sides, I don't know. I feel it feels like they left something on the table by kind of not going down there. It feels like that's a reason why you would introduce Lex at this point in time at this juncture in Clark's journey, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And it gives you further insight into maybe why they made the decision they did with Lex in the John Byrne reboot, where, not only is it arguably more interesting that he's this billionaire industrialist or whatever, but it also just giving him that legitimacy just gives you more scope to have him interact with all these other characters like Perry White and Lois Lane, all these people he wouldn't meet if he was just in prison the whole time or breaking out of prison or in a hideout somewhere. Like, he's never going to actually have these interactions. So it's, it makes it even more clear maybe why they made that decision,
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the times, that's a perfect segue that Lex does show up here. There's issue 38, which is actually a really interesting time travel issue where exactly what Lex does, I think, is a little nebulous because this was then followed up in an issue of Superman that we didn't specifically read. But essentially in this story, you have Superboy traveling to the future at the same time that Superman is traveling into the past, and they intersect each other in the time stream and they both get pushed out, but essentially they switch bodies. So you have adult Superman in the mind of Superboy in the past. And it's a cool hook for a story, mostly because, and again, you and I, we love Mom and Pa being alive, but if there's going to be a version of the story where they're not alive, this is an issue that I think really kind of mines the emotional richness of that, because you really feel the pain of Superman in Superboy's body, seeing his parents alive again, and it's Thanksgiving, and you see, all the friends show up for Thanksgiving dinner at the Kent house, and it's really this kind of wrenching emotional moment for him, and I thought that really stood out.
Yeah, it was really cool, and I just have to point out as well just a slightly smaller note, but the panel of the time stream of Superman flying in one direction and Superboy flying in the other, and the kind of ripples of time just crashing into each other. It's really ingeniously done. And then their two heads literally come together. It's really, really cool. But yeah, no, the kind of the emotional sort of whiplash he has of seeing his parents alive for the first time in who knows how long. And then this really weird thing happens whereby his mind is the adult Superman, but his body is still performing the actions of Superboy as if it's really strange and trippy. And then he starts reliving each day like Groundhog Day as well. So there's like 3 different layers to this.
I know there's a lot going on. You know, we had a fair amount of homework, so I didn't follow this thread to the issue of Superman that continued the story.
No, neither did I.
Although, and I'll keep this rant real quick, Rob, I did check to see if that issue was on the DC app. Take a wild guess.
No. Yeah. And do you know what? I read most of these issues on the DC app, and then there was a couple that I had to acquire through other means. But in fact, when I got the DC app for the first time, this was actually one of the first series that I really wanted to go back and read the whole thing, because again, it's just an era that really fascinates me. It's a series that I'm really, I forgot to mention this. I am grateful that this series in particular exists because, as you've mentioned before, for a long time in the 70s there, it was just Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, which is a very different thing and very different speed of story. And but then this was really back to basics, just Superboy in Smallville, solo adventures. Lex Luthor shows up every couple of issues, you know, so I was really grateful that this exists. And I really wanted to go back and read all of this, but there's like, I don't know how many of them is there. There's like maybe 12 issues altogether on DC.
Yep.
DC Infinite, which is a shame because this is well worth checking out.
Yeah. Again, I don't want to keep dumping on the Bronze Age Legion stories, but it's reading these issues, the series that we're talking about here, really just crystallized what I was missing in those Legion stories. This series is vastly more my speed. And like yourself, I'm grateful for this series because we get back to the Superboy centric Smallville set stories. But also, I mean, look, I really have come to appreciate the charm of the Silver Age stories, but I think having like this is such a critical piece, I think, to have in the Superboy lore, this 54 issue series. And anyway, I'm glad that it exists. I wish more of it were on the app or collected or available in some other way. But I will say I'm glad that I took the step of buying it on eBay. I'm glad to have it. I've got my my short box full of these, and I'm happy to have them. So that issue 38.
To your point about the you know, the smell and the ads and the letter pages and all that kind of stuff. The few issues I did read that weren't on DC, it was such a trip, you know, seeing all that stuff. And some of the letters pages were really fascinating. And there was this one that really stood out to me where and it was near the end of the series as well, which is unfortunate. But the reader wrote in and was like, oh, you know, my roommate makes fun of me for reading this comic. And he says, oh, it's a comic that nobody reads. And he's busy reading the Ex-Mutant's second cousin or whatever is the way he described it. But I love this series because it's nostalgic and it's fun. And what's wrong with a fun comic? And that's the way he put it, which I thought was really, really sweet. Now, I think in many ways, this comic is definitely trying to take a few lessons from, you know, that more popular comic. But I did think it was nice to read that. And comic book ads, man, I wish there was some way that they could reprint those somewhere because they're just fascinating and lovely, and like X-ray specs and all that kind of stuff. It just sends you down this rabbit hole of nostalgia.
I know, it really does. I mean, on a couple of levels, because you have the house ads for other DC projects, and especially, I can't remember if there were any in here. Definitely when we get to the Secret Years, ads for Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's one in particular where it's, you know, you see the silhouette of the Monitor, and it's like he's been watching the events of the DC universe for the past year. Now it's all coming to a head or something like that. So it's cool on that level. But yeah, just the ads for products. I mean, the early video games, all that stuff. Yeah, it's just wild. It really transports you back in time. You had mentioned the comic series that tied into the Superboy television show. I haven't read it yet, but I did also buy that on eBay. So I have that entire series. And when I was bagging and boarding them, I didn't flip through all of them, but just the back covers I took a look at. And there was one with an ad featuring OJ. And I was like, man, this is really a moment in time that's
Oh my
that's
goodness.
captured here, but that one really stood out.
There's actually there's a bunch of ads. I can't remember what he's even endorsing, but there's a bunch of ads with like Bill Cosby endorsing something in these issues, which is another thing for itself.
Yeah, no doubt.
Really can't wait for you to get to that tie-in comic, by the way, because it like, even if you completely divorce yourself from the TV show altogether and just read those comics, it addresses a lot of these kind of issues that I have with the whole Superboy concept. And I don't want to spoil it, but definitely check those out.
Cool. I'm excited. I don't know if that'll be its own episode, or I might just kind of sprinkle in talk about that as we do our Superboy TV mixtape episodes, which you'll be joining me for one of those. So we got a lot of fun stuff to come. But that issue 38 with the time travel switcheroo, that was essentially a Thanksgiving issue. And then issue 39 is a Christmas story of sorts, where Bashford is really down on the holiday. And just kind of how devoid of meaning and commercialized it's become. He storms off, and Superboy decides he's going to take him to another world because, of course, he knows about these infinite Earths and alternate realities, and takes him to a world where there is no Christmas, and it's sort of this dystopian, war ravaged place. And we have our band of freedom fighters, and Bash ultimately teaches these people the song "A Silent Night," right? Superboy hears it. He's like, how do you know this song? And then it turns out it was Bash who taught it to them. I don't know. What is your take on this one?
I mean, bit of fun. Christmas stuff is always a bit dodgy because it's like, we should respect people who don't like Christmas. There are plenty of valid reasons not to like it. There's people of other faiths. There is people that are just fed up with the commercialism of it. I worked in retail for 5 years. So when people tell me they don't like Christmas, I'm kind of like, yeah, that's okay. I respect that. That kind of way. I'm not going to like shove it in front of your face and insist that you like it. I thought it was a bit of fun. We haven't mentioned this yet, but Bashford, guys,
Yeah.
but they're clearly doing Flash Thompson.
Yes.
And it's like, you need to come up with a different name. It's just so lazy. I don't know. And it's like in Batman Beyond, then you have Nelson Nash. That's maybe a slightly classier way to pay homage to it, but it's still just copying the same sounding name. I don't know.
Yeah.
No, it's a fun issue though. No, I don't want to slide it. And Bashford, like, I think you kind of alluded to this earlier on. He is somewhat of a nuanced character throughout these issues. Like, he isn't just the straight one-dimensional bully. Like, sometimes he does have these redeeming features to his character. Unfortunately, so does Flash Thompson. So it's like, okay, well, you're just taking that. But no, I like the way he's written, and he is particularly charming in this one.
Yeah, and I think this issue was important, at least in kind of giving him a little bit more of a spotlight. He's been around, but I feel like in the Kupperberg issues we do get to see more with him, and he's, ultimately still this bully type character, but not in a sinister way. He comes off more as harmless than anything else. And you see them together enough where it's like, okay, like this is, part of a gang. Again, it is very Flash Thompson-esque, but there's definitely, maybe by contrast, it illuminates the character, because it's a stark difference between the Bash we get here versus the Steve Power character we'll get in Superman: The Secret Years, that bully who tries to pull all these pranks on Clark. So yeah, I think you get to see a little bit of an evolution, but yes, definitely very, very Flash Thompson-esque. All right. So then in issues 40 and 41, I think this is where we really get cooking here in this run. Because this is a two-parter that introduces this Lisa Davis character who has the interest in Clark. But we also see like bad boy Clark. We see him seemingly start to go off the deep end, and there's sort of a trio of events that seem to set him off. I mentioned earlier, he asks out the most popular girl in school to the dance, and she laughs in his face. There's a rescue that he's trying to perform. He makes a bit of a miscalculation. It's nothing horrific. Everyone's okay, but it doesn't go as smoothly as it could have. You have Ma Kent, who all of a sudden starts telling all her friends that her son is Superboy. And Clark and Jonathan can't make heads or tails of this. And their best guess, Clark's in particular, is that the strain of keeping this secret has unhinged Martha. So it's like this series of events that really kind of sets him off. And he ultimately, by the end of that first issue, has a very Spider-Man-esque moment where he he throws his costume away. He's done. Superboy no more.
Superboy no more. And that is in fact the caption on the first page. Superboy no more. Yeah, there it is.
Now, it turns out this is all the result of these aliens who have infected him with this organism. Not only is it affecting his behavior, but it's literally turning him into the Boy of Steel, literally. And he's going to be this robot that they're going to program, essentially. Let me ask you this. I mean, obviously, it gets to a point where, especially when there's a disaster happening in the streets of Smallville, and he willfully ignores it despite Jonathan saying, hey, you got to do something. So it gets to a point where, okay, there needs to be some kind of outside influence. Would you have preferred if they had kept it a little bit more tame and believable and made this an actual thing that he was going through, as opposed to he's being influenced, he's not himself? Or did you like the way it played?
Yes. No, yeah, absolutely. I would have preferred that. Yeah. Cause throughout the whole 2 issues, I was like, oh, wow, this is significant. Something's really happening here. There's going to be consequences to this. And then it was all just, aliens and a robot did it. And, it was all fine. I would have loved to have seen, okay, so maybe like Smallville, maybe he is being influenced in some way, shape or form, but it's reflective of feelings that are inside of him. And but more importantly, I would love to have seen real consequences after the fact, whereas it is kind of just wrapped up very, very quickly in the following issue, where it's like, oh well, no, a robot did it, and Martha Kent was just joking around. Everybody, it's fine, So it's almost like that. We were so close, you guys, that kind of way, and it feels like. Again, it just comes back to that sort of editorial thing. It's like, were they afraid to push the boat out too far? Were they afraid to kind of make these sort of lasting, kind of more psychological, character-driven stories in case they scared the readers away, and that they had to just sort of wrap it up quickly in this sort of tight little Silver Age bow, But yeah, no, I definitely would have preferred it if it was something that was really kind of lasting and meaningful, because it is convincing throughout these 2 issues. I was like, wow, this is okay. It's a little bit derivative of Spider-Man, but I'm really enjoying this, So yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I guess ultimately I get why they did this, and it did allow them to go a little bit bigger to heighten things, right? If it were just him, I guess they would need to scale it back a little bit. Not that he does anything so egregious, but in terms of the behavior, his bad boy behavior, he makes another play for Debbie, the most popular girl in school, and he does something that we would not see this in an issue today, rightfully so, but he just plants one on her, right?
You would 100% see that in like season 2 of Smallville, though.
Sure. Sure. We would not. Yeah, that's probably true. We wouldn't see that now. But you know what? Other than the kissing her without consent, the thing that really stood out to me about that exchange was when she's like, okay, I'll go out with, she's really swept up in this vigor that he's demonstrating. And she's like, okay, like pick me up at 7:30. He's like, I'll pick you up at 7. And she's like, okay, whatever you say.
Love it.
I don't know. That just made me laugh. Him.
All we're missing is like Elevation by U2 just playing underneath it or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Song
he shows off
on
the football field.
Yeah.
Right. And this is actually not the first time that he plays. When you go back to that William Wright 2-parter, the teacher with the mental powers, there you have, in particular, if I'm remembering correctly, Pete Ross encouraging Clark to play. He's like, hey, like, you could play, like, we'll have fun. And Clark, is particular about not using his powers. He ends up just tripping, though, on his own, which I liked. I felt like that was very endearing, because it wasn't, again, if I'm remembering all this correctly, it wasn't an act that he was putting on. Like, he legit just tripped. But I kind of like that. Speaking of Pete, by the way, I do appreciate how at a certain point in these issues, we no longer have to see the flashback of him in the tent with Clark over and over. They reduce it to a caption. That's like, as readers know, Pete Ross knows that Clark is Superboy, but has not shared this with Superboy. I'm like, all right, thank you. I know they still have to tell us every time.
I did not know that, by the way. I always assumed that Pete Ross knew that he was Superboy, and Superboy knew this about Pete Ross as well. I did not know until you started doing these issues that Pete Ross knows he's Superboy, but never tells him for some reason. That is brand new information. And that is a change that I'm grateful they made in Smallville, the show, because that would have just been really strange.
Yes. No, I agree. I mean, again, Smallville would essentially do that with Chloe for half a season, but at least
that's true.
But at least with Pete, no, I'm glad they didn't go down that road. It's an interesting, I don't know, it's kind of like an interesting angle for the character, but it just becomes so repetitive. But I do like how selfless Pete is with all of this. But anyway, Clark eventually figures out what's going on and is able to stop the aliens who infected him with this. And he reveals that he cured himself of his condition by electrocuting himself. And that fried whatever that organism was.
I have to say as well, by the way, I was disappointed that it all just turned out to be aliens and robots, but the kind of body horror concept of your whole internal organs being turned into a mechanical device, like there is something just sort of eerie and unsettling about that. And I feel like if I'd read this as a child, I would have been properly kind of like grossed out by it. And they do convey it pretty well, you know, for what is essentially a comic for kids. Like we see an X-ray of Clark's hand and it's like turning into this like Terminator skeleton. And you're kind of like, ugh, you know, it was for an idea that sounds so silly and so ridiculous. It is done quite well, I thought.
I don't disagree, but I do feel like, I don't know how well this all syncs up because the turning into steel versus essentially like his inhibitions are gone and he's just letting loose and he's kissing girls and he's on the football field. They don't feel like they really match up there. It's like if he's turning to steel and he's becoming very cold and distant, I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Like he's devoid of emotion, but it's the opposite. It's like he's more emotional, or at least letting his emotions out while he's turning to steel. I feel like maybe these could have been two different stories or something, but in any event, an interesting two-parter. And again, it introduces Lisa like this. And so this thread with Lisa, you know, we continue to see this play out over the course of the rest of the series there, where they start dating. And of course, and I'm going to jump around a little bit here, just kind of following this thread for a minute, but you know, as you would likely expect, there are times where he has to leave in the middle of a date. And initially she's a bit put off by this. She thinks he doesn't like her, and he confesses. He says, I think to her, he's like, you know, sometimes I just get weird and I need to be alone, which, hey, at least it's something, you know, at least it's some sort of catch-all excuse that would account for this behavior kind of on an issue to issue basis. But, you know, they seem to have a nice thing going. Like she's just a very nice, sweet girl. And I think the thing that I loved about this relationship, but just this run of issues overall, is that you started to see the shift in Clark.
Yes.
And he has a line at one point where he's like, you know, because of Lisa, when I'm with Lisa, I don't feel like I have to just be a superhero hiding behind glasses. I can be Clark. Like I can just be Clark and I don't have to be tripping over myself as much, essentially. You know what it is, I think in particular, that he tones down kind of the self-deprecating comments, because there are a lot of instances in these issues where he does kind of put himself down and comments on his own lack of personality. And Lisa in particular is like, hey, don't do that. You know, don't say that about yourself. And he does seem to take that to heart. So I was just curious what your reaction to that whole development was.
No, absolutely. I really, really like that. And that specific moment, I feel like it happens while he's like running out to do a Superboy thing. He has this kind of internal monologue where he's like, when I'm around Lisa, I don't feel like I need to act a certain way, or I don't need to put on a character of Clark. She just likes me as Clark or something like that. And I thought, wow, we're heading in the direction of, you know, triangle area type stuff, you know? So, you know, obviously being a comic from however many years ago, Lisa doesn't really have a lot of kind of personality traits beyond really, really liking Clark, but even just liking Clark for who he is kind of interesting in its own right, because it's something that was pretty rare in comics of that era, wasn't it? Like I can't recall too many other occasions where people really, really liked Clark and were kind of indifferent to Superboy, or Superman. So, you know, definitely thought that was cool. All right.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I feel like her claim to fame is she was nice and she liked Clark. I don't know that there's a ton more that we could really say about her. I don't know that she's one who would have gone the distance. I mean, she, again, likening her to Chloe, it does kind of have that feel as well. You go back to that first season of Smallville, which is really the most that they really kind of invested in maybe a relationship between the two of them. And, you know, it was like, oh, like she's nice and she's there. I don't know that the heat was really, and I know there are fans who would really disagree with me on that, but I don't know, I kind of get that vibe here, but it was not like, it was nice. And it was just cool to see this open up this whole other pocket of this character. And like we said, I think the Lana piece of it maybe could have used a rethinking a little bit, but still it brought out a different side to her as well. Like it mixed things up, and it was just nice to see them delving into that. And you know what, by the stories investing in more of the Clark Kent soap opera aspect, it invites the audience to, and clearly it resonated with us.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it was really good stuff. I enjoyed that. And so again, that 2-parter I think was a pretty big one. Now, after that comes that 3-parter we talked about with Johnny Weber, aka Dynamind. And we talked about the cosmic dust and sort of the A plot of all of this. But this 3-parter is also now what sets up this Jonathan Kent running for city council subplot, where you have Malcolm Davis, father of Lisa. So you have that connection point as well, coming to Jonathan and saying that there's this proposed deal to buy up this land outside Smallville, develop the shopping mall. It's going to be bad for all the businesses in town. And they want this, Malcolm Davis and the other merchants in town want Jonathan to run for city council to oppose the current city council president, Simmons, who owns the land and stands to make tens of millions of dollars on this deal. This is so nitpicky, man, but Malcolm Davis is a real estate agent. And I don't know why he would be so concerned about the shopping mall. It makes sense why the owner of a general store, why Jonathan Kent would be worried. And if Malcolm Davis was like, I own a clothing store or a department store of some kind, it's like, yeah, you don't want the competition from a mall, but would his business be that impacted? I don't know.
True enough. Yeah. I immediately remembered, and this predates this film, but Superman 4, the start of Superman 4, where Clark is trying to sell the farm and he's like, oh, we don't need another shopping center. And the real estate agent is like, Clark, the blink of an eye, this will all be gone. That's progress. That's normal, and I have to say, as someone who came from, the suburbs of the biggest city in my country, which is still not that big a city, but I was kind of like, really, Jonathan? Like a shopping mall would probably be, maybe it's not good for you with your local business, but like there's an awful lot of people that will benefit from this. Like it feels a little bit kind of like he's acting out of self-interest, and it doesn't feel as selfless as the book is making it out to be, if that makes sense. Now, I understand that, I'm coming to this from the perspective of someone who grew up in a larger suburb/city. So forgive me if my understanding of these socioeconomics isn't quite right, but that was my only thought, was like, well, maybe the shopping center would be a good thing, Jonathan. my other thought was, number one, if this was written by Stan Lee, but also if this was written by a modern writer, I feel like instead of Malcolm Davis being the helpful chap who comes along and says, hey, Jonathan, you should run for city council, Malcolm Davis would have been the Simmons. He would have been the antagonist. And then there would have been a nice Romeo and Juliet thing with Clark and Lisa.
Yes. I don't disagree. I feel like that might have left something on the table there. Although clear, there was more going on with Malcolm, because when he first brought it up, a little cagey in terms of how he found out about it. I think there was an as he was explaining it. He's like, I heard about a real estate deal. And whenever a character says that, there's something they're hiding. And then in the final issue of the series, he gets a call and he runs out of the Davis house, and we never know what that's about. Although I want to circle back to this because there is a book, and I sent you a photo of it, that has Paul Kupperberg's written but unpublished scripts. And so we have the script for what would have been New Adventures of Superboy 55. So I want to circle back to that.
Great.
But I agree with you about the whole mall thing. Again, I think our perspective, given our ages and where we each grew up, is very different. Yeah. So I get that. But here's the other X factor in all of this, which is Smallville's a town on the map. Right? I think, we're thinking about it as, like this little small town, but it's like this, and we've seen there was at least one issue in the Bates run where it's a tourist destination. You have this whole tour bus of people who come because Superboy lives there.
Yeah.
So I feel like that just kind of colors everything a little bit differently. And this is not maybe the small town that we and they are kind of speaking about it as. It's in any event. So Davis wants Jonathan to run. And initially Jonathan says, no, he doesn't even tell Martha about it at first until Davis shows up again at the house. And he's like, hey, and I'm kind of jumping ahead now because this thread really plays out over the rest of the series here. But we have a sequence of events where Jonathan says, no, like, this isn't for me. I'm not going to do this. And then you have a couple of goons who show up at the general store and try to intimidate him into backing down and not realizing he had already decided not to do it. And that solidifies his decision to run, because he's not going to let these guys push him around. And then it continues to escalate where he gets a call in the middle of the night threatening him. They blow up the Kent General Store. And the final domino in this is there are two guys who are apprehended at the general store before they can do anything to Jonathan, but they were essentially hitmen who were hired to take him out, presumably, or at least intimidate him into backing out. So you have this whole sequence where it's really kind of the stakes are high with this city council election. Yeah, and very reminiscent of Smallville and Jonathan
100%.
Kent's bid for state senate in season 5.
Am I wrong? Like, there's this great moment where Martha is like, Jonathan, you need to get Clark's help on this. This is crazy. Like, people are trying to kill you. And he's like, oh, well, no, Martha, I don't want to bother him or something. And it's a real Jonathan Kent. Like, it's a flaw, but it's like a realistic flaw that I appreciated, that he wouldn't want to bother his son with this kind of small scale thing that's happening to him. But then these guys get arrested and these goons are apprehended and all. Does Clark have a moment of kind of like, oh my goodness, I should have taken more of an interest in what was going on, and like I should have done more to help him? Like, I feel like that was another great moment where Clark could have learned something, you know?
Yeah. So I asked a couple of things. There is one issue, I forget where it falls in this, or if it was one of the ones we skimmed or skipped, but there is an issue where Martha confides in Clark.
Okay.
And she tells him, which I really liked that. I like this family dynamic where, yes, Jonathan is the patriarch of the family. He's like, no, don't tell him. But it's like, no, she's going to tell Clark because, you know, like, he needs to know. And so I really like that. But yeah, as far as I remember, it's not like Clark really ends up doing much with this information. So I feel like, look, ultimately, I'm grateful this subplot was here. I mean, it offered a lot. It would have been awesome. And I know, given the just kind of the limitations of the day and this time period, this wouldn't be the case. But I wish this had been the driver for the various issues that we're talking about here, as opposed to, it's really just something that's in the background. And you don't even end up seeing any of Jonathan's actual campaigning or anything like that. It's just more about the decision to run or not, and then these intimidation efforts. But yeah, I wish that more of these issues could have been built around the election, the campaign, because it was really interesting and gave the Kents something else to do besides just advising Clark. So
it's really nice though, just seeing like the genesis of this kind of storytelling. So we're in 1983 at this point, and we're seeing these little subplots that we really, really like. And then you get to like 1987, and there's a whole World of Metropolis 4-part series where it's just Perry White, calling up investors, trying to get people to save the Daily Planet. And then there's World of Smallville, and you get to see the whole history of Jonathan and Martha and how they met and how they got together. And that's it. And there's no superheroics or anything. So this is really the building blocks of that. And, maybe they were afraid to go too far in that direction just yet, but they got there eventually, So I'm grateful that they were taking these baby steps, And in many ways, with modern comics, I wish we could get more of that now, whereas now it's probably a sales thing. It's like if we did an entire issue about Jonathan Kent in the Korean War, it probably wouldn't sell,
No, I agree. I think it is very much a lost art. And I think probably the perceived lack of sales appeal of that is probably a big factor for it. But I agree. I think there's so much value to it. And kind of following this thread to its sort of conclusion, in the final issue of the series, you have Simmons, the city council president, who's standing to make millions of dollars, has his guys grab Jonathan, takes him out to a field, tries to bribe him, buy him off. Jonathan's not having it. And, it's very ominous air between them because it's sort of like, well, you better get in line or else. And Jonathan just leaves. Now, I'm very grateful for this book that's out there because we know what Kupperberg had not only planned, but actually written for New Adventures of Superboy number 55, which would have been published had the title not been canceled. And there's a great article. I think it comes from Back Issue Magazine, if I'm not mistaken, but it's included in the book that kind of summarizes all of this. And essentially, the next issue would have opened with Jonathan Kent, a distracted-looking Jonathan Kent, seemingly grabbing Chief Parker's gun, shooting and killing Malcolm Davis, and then running out of the council meeting. And then we would have caught up with him knocked out by Simmons, the hero of the day, who apprehended Jonathan Kent after Jonathan killed Malcolm. They would, of course, Jonathan would be arrested and all that. And thankfully, Chief Parker and Superboy are on his side and know that this must not actually be the case. And it would have turned out that Simmons hired someone to impersonate Jonathan and kill Malcolm Davis. And they kind of send Jonathan in undercover and is ultimately able to get Malcolm or Simmons to confess to this. That's a very short version of this. I didn't pour through the entire script, but that's where this was going. I don't know if there would have been much beyond that, but at least that's kind of the head that this was building towards. There was no kind of final fate for Lisa given, but Kupperberg said in an interview, his idea was that Lisa and her mom probably would have left town, but that he wanted to do something with adult Lisa and Clark in Metropolis. So that could have been cool. But that's what would have been a New Adventures of Superboy 55.
I'm just picturing the cover, and it's like Jonathan Kent holding a smoking gun over Malcolm Davis's corpse, and he's turned to Superboy and he's like, "I'm sorry, son, I have to kill your girlfriend's father," or something. He's like, "Pa, what are you doing?" or something like that. It would have been one of those gotcha covers that they always did back then.
Dude, 1,000%. So that would have been number 55. The series was canceled before that. The plan was, and this was talked about in the letters pages, there was going to be a new series, a new 48-page per issue series called DC Double Comics. And it would have been Superboy and Supergirl sharing the book. And the gist of the Superboy part, at least initially, was that he was going to be organizing and leading this international team of superheroes. That was kind of the setup for what would have been DC Double Comics. But plans changed. We had Crisis. All of this fell away. But that's what we would have had. And that book that I've been mentioning has the scripts for issues 1 and 2 of DC Double Comics. So, fascinating stuff when you think about what could have been, if not for sales/Crisis.
Wow. So it was going to be completely different from this kind of Smallville set stuff. It was going to be its own thing altogether, but it was still written by Paul Kupperberg.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know that they would have discarded the Smallville setting, but it would have, I think the scope definitely would have expanded. So it would have been distinct from this, but again, fascinating. But anyway, that subplot I think was really a highlight of all of this. But after that Johnny Weber arc that we've been talking about that introduced the city council bit, we had a 3-parter with the Japanese villain Sunburst. I did not read that one, so I don't really have anything to say on that. Then we get another Lex appearance where he comes up with this device that steals most of Clark's powers, except his X-ray vision. And this, going back to robots, we have an instance of Clark using his robots to try to trick Lex into thinking that the device didn't work. So again, I think this is very much in keeping with the kinds of Lex stories that we've been seeing in this era, right?
Yeah, but I mentioned this in our All-Star Superfan episode on the John Byrne reboot. I think it's very easy to dismiss Bronze Age / Platinum Age Lex Luthor, but there's actually some incredible stories from that era. And unfortunately, I don't think these are really don't really illustrate that. But like Elliot S. Magan and definitely Carrie Bates to some extent, like did amazing stuff with Lex in the late 70s and the 80s. And yeah, I get that it was just to sell toys, but like they introduced the power armor suit thing around that time. And some of the stories that center around that are really, really, really good. Like the story Luthor Unleashed is like one of my favorite Lex Luthor stories. But yeah, this is really just a gimmick story where he gets Superman's powers and he gets a suit that's literally only in this issue, where it's kind of a purple suit with LL and a kind of a Martian Manhunter cape. Yeah, again, it's just disappointing that they couldn't tie into the sort of Lex and Superboy being friends thing that we know from other versions. And weirdly, like I feel like they did that more in Superman comics. That Superman was always like, I know the good in you, Lex, and I think you can be good again if you just give up your wicked ways and all that. Whereas Superboy doesn't really get into that at all. At least these ones I've read,
Yeah, no, I hear you. I it's funny because when I see Lex on the cover, I'm like, yes, I got a Lex issue. Those ended up, I think, being some of the least compelling ones. But I think you hit the nail on the head, man. I think it is the fact that it's so, the Lex of it all feels so disconnected from everything else. I think that's why these don't really land with us maybe the way we want them to. 49 was that Zatara issue that I mentioned. And then number 50, big anniversary issue, and the only instance of the Legion of Superheroes appearing in this series, where we have a thief in the future who steals the dial H for hero dial, reprograms it to conjure villains, and escapes into the past and teams up with Lex, and the Legion comes back and they have to track him down. And Clark brings the Legion to the Kent house for a barbecue while there's a lull in their investigation. We also get the sequence of Clark and Lisa and the whole gang at the lake swimming and having a picnic. It's what I liked about this one is I feel like it, and I think, I'm sure this was by design, right? That this was the anniversary issue. You had Keith Giffen doing some of the art, sharing duties with Kurt Schaffenberger, where you have the Legion, you have Lex, you have Lana, you have the whole gang, you have the Kents. Like, it really felt like it was attempting to sort of, blend all of these aspects of this era of the character together.
Yeah, and I have to be honest, when I started reading this issue and it starts in the 34th century or whenever the Legion is set, and it's all Legion stuff at the very start, and I was like, oh God, this is going to be one of those ones that just is not for me. And then suddenly we're having a pool party and Bashford is slipping and falling into the lake and all this, and I was like, oh no, wait, hold on a second. And then as over the course of the issue, and then the Dial H for Hero thing came up, and I was like, oh, I haven't really been reading those, so I don't know what this is. But that came into the story in a really interesting way as well. And it just all kind of came together in a really nice way. It's a great issue. And I think it helps as well that it's a little bit longer, isn't it? It's like 42 pages, that one.
Yeah.
So that they're able to tell a more kind of complex story. But no, yeah, I really like that one, actually.
Yeah, it was fun. I was not reading the Dial H for Hero backups either. This is a tangent, but the only real experience I think that I've had with Dial H for Hero, there was a revival series in the early 2000s. And I want to say it was Will Pfeiffer who wrote it. And I remember reading a little bit of that at the beginning, and I liked it. I enjoyed it, but that's kind of the extent of my experience with that concept in the DC universe. But yeah, it was a fun anniversary issue. Issue 51, you and I are going to talk about next week. That actually collects various backup stories from the In-Between Years segment that Bob Rozakis had written in Superman in the years prior, and it tees up the Secret Years miniseries. So that's issue 51. And then our last few issues here, there's one with this old as the hills man who lives on the outskirts of town, who all the kids are mean to. And it turns out he's this alien who's been stranded on Earth. And, you see Clark and Jonathan, the kindness and the compassion that they show to him. And the final two-parter deals with the Superboy Revenge Squad, these aliens who team up to try to take Superboy out. But again, I think the real meat for those issues was really kind of the furtherance of this city council subplot. Was there anything from those final issues that stood out to you that you wanted to talk about?
No, just very quickly, the one about the old man that turns out to be an alien, I really like that one because Clark actually kind of learns a lesson in it a little bit, because everyone is sort of dismissing this man because he's a vagrant and he's homeless and he's kind of strange and he smells and all this sort of stuff. And Jonathan is just really, really nice to him and gives him, free produce from the grocery shop or whatever. And Clark's like, why are you being so nice to this strange, eccentric vagrant? And he's like, well, he's a man just like us, Clark. And I just thought it's maybe a slightly juvenile lesson for, a 17 or 18-year-old to be learning, but I just thought it was really nice. And the story as it progresses, the idea of him being this ancient alien, I actually didn't see that coming, to be honest. But it was really, really well done. And it was just a nice feel good story, and it let Jonathan be that sort of guiding light that he is so well in these stories. And it showed Clark not necessarily having all the answers or being as wise as we know him to be when he's Superman, which I kind of like when they do stuff like that with Superboy. So yeah, no, just that one sort of stood out to me as well. And I like the way they draw the old man. He's got these big sort of ominous, haunting looking eyes. And then later on you find out, oh, it's because he's an alien. But that was a good one.
Yeah, and with the paw piece, the fact that, he tells Clark this story about how when he was a kid, his friends and Jonathan himself would make fun of this guy.
Yes. And
then Jonathan had this moment, of seeing the pain in this guy's eyes of like, oh, like this is not the right way to be. And so he never did that again. And in fact, now, like you said, goes so far as to give him food whenever he comes into the store. rice and vegetable soup, I think is his standing order. So no, I like that. And that the fact that Jonathan is leading by example, sharing a story from his own experience, and the fact that this is, again, I think in keeping with the kind of advice that like we're used to from the modern era here. Yeah, I know. I like that aspect a lot. And yeah, I mean, that takes us to the end of this series here. I mean, I had such a great time with this. I don't know what else to say, but it was really a treat. And it's one of those things where, like we said, there are at least some issues that are available on the DC app. If I'll say this first, if you go to your local comic shop and they've got back issue bins and you can find any of those issues, I would definitely recommend it. I had a lot of success on eBay and it didn't break the bank. But again, while I never endorse piracy, if there are no other reasonable means of finding these and you need to do what you need to do, again, they're well worth reading, and especially the ones that we've really hit on and we've laid out. And if there are any that we've talked about in either half of this episode that you're like, wow, that really sounds interesting, give it a read. I think this is a series that really deserves another look or a first look.
Yeah, I completely agree. The kind of the last general point I wanted to make about the series is you really feel like in the late 70s and the early 80s, DC are properly leaning into the whole Marvel method now. And they're really like, we need to make these books more like those that are selling loads when ours aren't. And you can really, even just looking at some of the covers, like I'm looking at issue 35 here, and there's this like giant guy with a net and he's trying to net Superboy and he's actually netting the logo. And it's just really, really dynamic. There's a couple of covers where he's like coming up against giants type figures, like that 43, then it's part of the Dynamite arc, and there's this giant Jack Kirby looking monster. He looks like the Thing from Fantastic Four, and he's like emerging out of the ground, and Superboy's firing heat vision at him, and there's no dialogue. Like, it's just this cool dynamic action scene, and you see it and you're like, wow, I want to buy this comic. And then the very next one, it's like this King Trident looking guy from The Little Mermaid. I could have said Aquaman, but I said The Little Mermaid. And he's like throwing a trident at Superboy. It's just really cool. Like, and there's a lot of covers like that where it's more about the action and it's more about these dynamic situations Superboy's in, as opposed to, the Silver Age where it would be Superman at a weenie roast and Krypto's using his X-ray vision to roast the hot dogs or something. It's way more kind of like, no guys, this is badass and you need to buy this. And I heard someone refer to this era. I don't know if you've ever heard of this before, but I referred to this on Twitter as the Bronze Age Superman. And someone's like, well, no, actually, when you get this far into like the years that are just pre-crisis, like 1983, 4, 5, that's actually referred to as the Platinum era. Did you know that? Or the Platinum Age?
Only generally, only in the sense that I know there are various other subdivisions, like the period right before the Silver Age, I know is often referred to as the Atomic Age.
Okay, yeah.
So I know that these other designations and subdivisions are out there. I've never been so moved to try to, learn exactly what the lines of demarcation are. But so just kind of generally, I know what you're talking about.
I've heard that, sorry to tangent here, but I've heard the Triangle era being referred to as the Steel Age as well, which I quite like.
Yes. Yeah, I do like that as well. I don't know. I guess I'm kind of torn on this because on the one hand, I kind of like the shorthand of we have these three main, although obviously Triangle era now we're in the post-crisis. So yeah, I don't know. If everyone could get on board with it, I like it. If it's the sort of thing where you have to explain it every time you say it, then it's like defeats the purpose.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Oh, well, my last thing, this is not really tied to a particular issue, but I don't know that it's really come up in these discussions. This is the last hurrah, I believe, of Smallville being set on the East Coast, because this does come up in certain issues where there is reference to Smallville being on the East Coast, and in fact, there's an issue where Clark and his family fly to California and he meets Hal Jordan, and it's like this cross country flight. If I'm not mistaken, I believe Wikipedia had said this, so it must be true. I think it's Superman the movie that is the first instance of Smallville being in Kansas. That I guess is then later more officially adopted, and we see that moving forward post-crisis. But in these stories, and again, if I'm mistaken in this in any respect, please people reach out. But Smallville is set on the East Coast, and I think it's kind of like, Metropolis is like New York, and Smallville is close by.
That's nuts. I knew I did have it pointed out to me that Kansas wasn't specifically the designated place that Smallville was in, but I never knew that it was like the East Coast. I always just assumed it was sort of somewhere in Middle America that wasn't defined, and then Superman the movie said Kansas, and that's why they picked that. But I never knew it was the East Coast. That's blowing my mind here. I never knew that.
I'm nearly positive, because I feel like I don't know if it was in one of those Bronze Age stories where he's coming or going from the future, and or some of these issues where there's at least some fleeting reference to it being on the East Coast. And I definitely know it was that cross country flight when he went out to California. So yeah, I know, kind of wild to think about. But it's like, New York is big, and there's farmland when you go upstate. So I guess we can kind of reconcile it in that way. But anyway, henceforth, as we move forward into the next era, we'll be firmly in the Kansas territory. But this was awesome. I appreciate you coming along for this ride, reading these issues, sharing your insight. It was a lot of fun. We're not done, because you'll be back next week, and we'll be talking about Superman, The Secret Years. In the meantime, we've mentioned your podcast, All-Star Superfan. What do you want to tell folks about it?
Yeah, so by the time this goes out, we will have our epic discussion on the John Byrne 1986 reboot. That will be out. And that ties in nicely with this, because we talk about Superboy a lot in that episode, because obviously that was one of the major changes that was made. And we talk about, we got a lot of correspondence from listeners about, well, I'm not even sure if they were listeners or just people who caught on to the tweet, but there was a lot of people who talked about the things they liked and disliked about the change. And there was a lot of Superboy fans that reached out and said, well, this got rid of the Legion of Superheroes, and it broke my heart for that reason, and they've never fixed that as a result. So really, really interesting discussion about that. And then we've also recently recorded an episode that looks at all the various different depictions of Metallo across Superman media, and that'll be out next month. And we do discuss an episode of Superboy the series in there as well, because Metallo shows up in that show like 5 times. So check that out as well.
All right. I hope everyone will check that out. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, audience. My thanks once again to John Wilson, who joined me for the first part of this episode. Make sure you come back next week as our Superboy coverage continues. We'll be looking at the final days of Pre-Crisis Superboy, with discussions of the miniseries Superman, The Secret Years, as well as the post-crisis storyline, The Greatest Hero of Them All. Don't miss it. And until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. We are an affiliate of BCW Supplies, so the next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Thank you. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Another Exciting Episode in the Adventures of Superman, an episode-by-episode breakdown of the classic George Reeves television show, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.